Hey, welcome back, friend. If you are new here, I am so glad you found this little corner of the night. And if you have been with me for a while, well, you already know how this goes. Get comfortable. Pull that blanket a little closer. Tonight we're going somewhere most history books barely dare to whisper about. Let me ask you something. What if you woke up one morning perfectly healthy, perfectly fine, kissed your family goodbye, walked out the door to go to work, and never came home again? Not because of a war, not because of a car accident, not because of anything you could see or touch or fight back against, but because the air itself had turned against you. Now imagine that happening not to one person, but to 50 million people around the world in less than 2 years. That is not a movie plot. That is not a nightmare someone made up. That is the autumn of 1918, and tonight we're going to live through it together. Before we dive in, if this kind of storytelling speaks to you, if you find yourself settling in and thinking, okay, this is exactly what I needed tonight, do me a small favor, would you? Hit that subscribe button, give this video a like and maybe drop a comment down below. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I genuinely love knowing that someone in, say, a little apartment in Ohio or a cozy house in the English countryside is listening along with me in the dark. It means everything, truly. Now dim those lights if you can. Maybe put on a soft fan in the background, and let us begin. The year is 1918. The world is exhausted. 4 years of World War I have ground Europe into dust. Millions of young men have been fed into the trenches of France and Belgium and Germany, living in mud, breathing poison gas, eating whatever they could find. Back home in the United States, women were working factory jobs for the first time. Children were collecting scrap metal for the war effort. Entire cities smelled like grief and sacrifice and liberty bonds. People were tired. They wanted the war to end. They wanted their sons and husbands back. And in the middle of all that, in the middle of all that exhaustion and hope and quiet desperation, something else arrived. Something that did not announce itself. Something that did not send a telegram or a warning shot. It arrived the way a whisper does so softly at first that you almost did not notice it at all. His name was Albert Gitchell. He was a cook. Just a regular army cook, 20-something years old, stationed at Camp Funston in Fort Riley, Kansas. On the morning of March 4th, 1918, he showed up at the camp's infirmary, complaining of what seemed like a pretty ordinary cold, sore throat, headache, a little fever. Nothing unusual for a military camp in early spring. By noon that same day, over 100 soldiers had reported the exact same symptoms. By the end of the week, 500 soldiers were sick. Now here is the part that nobody talks about, and this is the detail that keeps historians up at night. Those soldiers at Camp Funston were just weeks away from being shipped off to Europe. Tens of thousands of young American men packed onto crowded transport ships sailing across the Atlantic to join the war. And they brought something extra with them. Historians today largely believe that what Albert Gitchell caught that cold March morning, that seemingly unremarkable moment of a man with a runny nose, was actually the very beginning of one of the deadliest events in all of recorded human history. Think about that for a second. One cook, one ordinary morning, one sore throat. Now the spring wave of 1918, the wave that Albert unknowingly helped set in motion, was actually fairly mild. People got sick, people recovered. Medical officers in the military camps noticed the numbers, but did not raise too many alarms. America was at war. There were bigger things to worry about. But viruses, it turns out, are patient teachers. That spring wave was the virus learning, moving through hundreds of thousands of bodies, changing, adapting, getting better, if you can call it that, at what it did. And when it came back in the fall, it came back as something else entirely, something monstrous. September 28th, 1918. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. 200,000 people lined Broad Street for the Liberty Loan Parade, one of the biggest parades the city had ever seen. Brass bands, marching soldiers, nurses waving from floats, cheering crowds pressed so tightly together that people could barely breathe. The city's health director, a man named Wilmer Cruson, had been warned by local physicians not to hold the parade. The flu was already circulating in the city. Military and naval bases in the area were already reporting alarming numbers of sick and dying. He held the parade anyway. 72 hours later, just 3 days, Philadelphia hospitals were overwhelmed. Within 2 weeks, more than 11,000 people were dead in the city. By the time the second wave finished with Philadelphia, the death toll would reach nearly 14,000, all in a matter of weeks. 14,000 people. For context, Philadelphia lost roughly 5,000 soldiers in all of World War I. The parade killed more people than the war did. Now here is something about this pandemic that I find quietly devastating, and I want you to sit with this for a moment. We tend to think of the flu as something that kills the very old and the very young. That is how flu works, right? It goes after the fragile ones, the vulnerable ones, the immune systems that are not quite strong enough yet or that have grown tired with age. The 1918 flu did not care about any of that. It killed young people, specifically and preferentially young people. The death rate for people between the ages of 15 and 34 was 20 times higher than in any previous flu epidemic on record. 20 times. The peak of mortality was right around age 27. Think about who is 27 years old. They are just getting started. They have just gotten married, maybe. They have babies at home. They are the backbone of their families, their communities, their workplaces. They are the ones who are supposed to carry the world forward. And they were dying at a rate that made no medical sense at all. Doctors at the time were baffled. We still do not fully understand it a century later. One theory suggests that older adults, those over 65 or so, had some partial immunity because they had survived an earlier influenza outbreak in the 1890s. Their immune systems had a kind of memory, even if they did not know it. But the young adults of 1918, they had never seen anything like this before. Their immune systems attacked the virus with everything they had, and in some cases that ferocious immune response was exactly what killed them. Their own bodies fighting so hard caused their lungs to fill with fluid. It is a tragedy wrapped inside a biological irony. The strongest bodies fought the hardest, and sometimes the ones who fought the hardest lost the most. Let me tell you about a doctor named Roy Grist. On September 29, 1918, he sat down in surgical ward number 16 at Camp Devens in Massachusetts, a military base about 40 miles outside of Boston, and he wrote a letter to a friend. In that letter, he described what he was watching happen to young American soldiers. He wrote that his patients seemed to arrive with what looked like ordinary influenza, but within hours they developed the most vicious pneumonia he had ever seen. Their skin turned a strange bluish-grey colour, a condition called cyanosis from lack of oxygen in the blood. The colour spread from their ears across their cheeks, until, as Grist wrote it, became hard to tell one man's skin colour from another's. He described men struggling simply to breathe. He said it was the most horrible thing he had ever witnessed, and this was a man who'd been watching soldiers die in a world war. At Camp Devens that September, 6,674 soldiers came down with the flu in a single week. The camp's hospital had been built to treat 1,200 patients. They had to convert every available space, hallways, offices, the gymnasium into overflow wards. Nurses moved from bed to bed in a kind of controlled panic, doing what they could, which was heartbreakingly little. And here is the thing that I think about every time I sit down with this story. Most people living through the fall of 1918 did not fully understand what was happening to them. They knew people were sick. They could see that. They could see the empty pews in church, the dark windows of the neighbour's house, the black wreath hanging on the door down the street. They could see the lines outside pharmacies stretching around the block, but the scale of it, the terrifying, almost incomprehensible scale of what was unfolding across the whole world, was something that most ordinary people could not access. Because the newspapers were not telling the full truth. Because the government did not want anyone to lose faith in the war effort. Because nobody wanted to say out loud what the numbers actually meant. So people died quietly, confused, frightened, often alone, and life in the most surreal human way possible continued around them. Streetcars still ran, factories still hummed, children where schools were still open still went to class. Somewhere across town someone was still playing jazz on a piano, and the virus, completely indifferent to all of it, kept moving. By October of 1918, the flu had reached every corner of the United States. It had crossed oceans. It had walked into villages in sub-Saharan Africa and into crowded tenements in New York City. It had arrived in the remotest islands of the South Pacific. Indigenous communities in Alaska were being wiped out. Some villages lost 40% of their entire population. Some villages simply disappeared. In India, which was under British colonial rule at the time, somewhere between 12 and 17 million people died. Some estimates go higher. The decade between 1911 and 1921 was the only 10-year period in Indian history where the total population actually fell. Let that land. An entire country's population shrank because of a flu. Meanwhile, the total number of deaths worldwide from 4 years of World War I, one of the most destructive conflicts in human history, was around 17 million people. The 1918 flu in 2 years killed somewhere between 50 and 100 million people. More than all the bombs, all the gas attacks, all the machine guns, all the trenches of the Great War combined. And yet, and this is perhaps the strangest part of all, we barely talk about it. It became, in the words of historians, the forgotten pandemic. People who lived through it rarely spoke about it afterward. Not because they did not want to, but because some griefs are too large to put into words. Because sometimes the only way to keep moving is to pack the horror away somewhere quiet and keep walking. But tonight we are going to remember. We are going to walk back into that world, the world of 1918, and we're going to see what life actually looked like. Not from the view of presidents or generals or newspaper headlines, from the view of ordinary people. A young mother in Philadelphia wiping down her doorstep because someone told her vinegar might help. A soldier in France writing a letter home that would arrive after he did. A nurse working a double shift, then a triple shift, too tired to cry anymore. A little girl in Kansas who did not understand why her father did not come down for breakfast. These are the stories that got swallowed by history, and we are going to bring them back. We have just scratched the surface of what happened in the fall of 1918. We've met the virus at its very beginning, that quiet, almost invisible morning in a Kansas military kitchen, and we've watched it begin to show its true face. But here is what I have not told you yet. The flu did not spread randomly. It followed a very specific path, and that path was not just determined by the wind or the weather or bad luck. It wore a uniform. It travelled first class on troop ships. It moved at the speed of war, and when you understand how it spread, how it hitched a ride on the greatest military mobilization in American history, the story gets even darker, even more heartbreaking than you might expect. That is exactly where we are heading next. So now you know how it started. One cook, one sore throat, one cold March morning in Kansas. But here is the thing I've been turning over in my mind for years. Every time I come back to this story, the beginning is almost never the most interesting part. It is what happens next that reveals everything. Because what happened next in 1918 was this: the United States military did something extraordinary, something unprecedented in American history. In the span of just a few months, they took ordinary men, farmers, factory workers, school teachers, boys, who'd never travelled more than 30 miles from home, and they packed them into enormous training camps, tens of thousands at a time, and they prepared to send them across an ocean. And without knowing it, without meaning to, they handed the virus exactly what it needed. Let me paint you a picture of what these training camps actually looked like. By the spring of 1918, the United States military had grown from roughly 378,000 soldiers to nearly 4.5 million almost overnight. To house them all, the army built 32 massive training camps across the country, each one holding between 25,000 and 55,000 men. Think about that. 55,000 men in one place, sleeping in barracks built so close together that you could hear the man next to you breathe. They ate together in crowded mess halls. They trained together in tight formations. They used the same latrines, shared the same water, breathed the same recycled air in those wooden barracks all through the long Kansas winters and Georgia summers. If you were a virus, and I am just asking you to think like one for a moment, you could not have designed a more perfect environment. The camps, in a very real sense, were incubators, not for soldiers, for illness. Now something happened in those camps that I think deserves more attention than it usually gets. In the spring of 1918, as the first wave of flu began moving through the military, the Army's own chief medical officer, a man named Charles Richard, who held the title of Acting Army Surgeon General, looked at what was happening and raised his hand. He wrote urgent memos. He warned his superiors that sending troops from infected camps overseas was dangerous, that the troop ships were floating powder kegs, and that the only sensible thing to do was to slow down the movement of men until the situation was clearer. He was ignored. The man who overruled him was Army Chief of Staff Peyton March. March's position was blunt and, from a purely military standpoint, logical. Germany was collapsing. The Allies were pushing back on the Western Front. American troops were the decisive advantage. Stopping the flow of soldiers, even for a week, even for 10 days, could cost the Allies the war. President Woodrow Wilson agreed with March, so the ships kept sailing. In March of 1918, alone, 84,000 American troops crossed the Atlantic. Another 118,000 followed in April, and they carried the virus with them. Here is something I want you to really sit with for a second, because this is the part that gets me every time. The troop ships crossing the Atlantic in 1918 were not comfortable cruise liners. They were converted passenger vessels and cargo ships stripped down and repacked with as many men as they could possibly hold. Soldiers slept in hammocks stacked 3 and 4 high, below decks with almost no ventilation. In some ships, men slept in shifts because there were not enough sleeping spaces for everyone at once. They ate in rotating groups. They stood in lines for everything. When one man got sick, there was simply no way to isolate him. There was no space. There was no separate ward. The sick slept next to the healthy, breathed on the healthy, coughed into the same stale air that the healthy breathed. The 15th United States Cavalry lost 36 men to influenza and 6 to death on a single Atlantic crossing, a single voyage, a single ship. By the time the war ended, historians estimate that roughly 12,000 American soldiers died of influenza on the troop ships before they ever set foot on European soil, before they ever saw a battlefield, before they fired a single shot. 12,000 men, killed by a virus on a boat in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The war took them from home, the flu took them before the war ever got the chance. And what did those ships deliver to Europe? Well, by April of 1918, influenza had arrived in Brest, France, one of the main ports, where American troops disembarked. French soldiers stationed there began falling ill. British troops caught it next and carried it across the English Channel. The Royal Navy reported more than 10,000 sailors stricken in the early months of the epidemic, which effectively kept parts of the British fleet grounded in port. By May and June, the flu had rolled across the Western Front like a second army. 3/4 of all French troops were sick at some point during the first wave. Half of all British forces reported influenza. And on the other side of the wire, over 900,000 German soldiers fell ill. Let me pause here for a moment because I think this number deserves its own breath. 900,000 German soldiers. The German army's Great Spring Offensive of 1918, what historians call the Kaiserschlacht or Kaiser's Battle, was already underway. It was Germany's last desperate attempt to break through Allied lines before American reinforcements changed the balance of the war for good. And it nearly worked. German forces pushed deeper into France than they had in years. Paris itself was under threat. And then the flu swept through. Some military historians argue carefully, because this is contested territory, that the influenza epidemic may have actually contributed to Germany's failure that summer. Not entirely and not on its own. But when you have 900,000 men sick, when unit after unit is stumbling into battle already feverish and exhausted, when the men who are supposed to push forward can barely stand, it matters. The flu did not end the war, but it may have nudged history in ways we will never fully calculate. Meanwhile, back in the United States, something strange and quietly tragic was happening. The virus was moving as viruses do from the military camps into the surrounding towns. Soldiers on leave visited their families. Civilians came to the camps on business, on visits, on the ordinary errands of daily life. Workers at the factories making uniforms and boots and ammunition lived next to families of soldiers. Everything was connected, as it always is, by the invisible threads of daily human contact. And yet for most of the spring and early summer of 1918, the flu remained largely invisible in public conversation. Why? Because it was wartime. And in wartime, you do not talk about things that hurt morale. Every country involved in the war had implemented some form of press censorship. In the United States, the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918 gave the federal government sweeping powers to suppress information deemed harmful to the war effort. Newspapers that criticized the government or published discouraging news could face serious consequences. So when the flu began killing soldiers in the spring of 1918, newspapers did not lead with that story. The war was the story. Victory was the story. American boys were brave and strong and unstoppable. The flu that was just a little bug, nothing to worry about. This silence, I believe, was one of the most consequential decisions made during the entire pandemic. Not a decision made by any single person in any single room, but a collective reflexive choice made by governments and newspaper editors and military officers, all at the same time, each for their own reasons. And the price of that silence would be paid in autumn. Now you may be wondering about the name. If this flu did not come from Spain, why did the whole world call it the Spanish flu? The answer is so human that it almost makes you laugh, if it were not so unfortunate. Spain was neutral in World War I. They had no wartime censorship laws governing the press. So when the flu arrived in Spain in the spring of 1918 and began killing people, including famously King Alfonso XIII, who fell ill in May, the Spanish newspapers reported it. Fully, openly, with headlines. Those Spanish reports were then picked up by news agencies around the world and reprinted in countries that had been silent about their own outbreaks. To readers in France, in Britain, in the United States, it suddenly seemed as though the flu was a Spanish problem, as though it had come from Spain. Spain was not pleased. Spanish newspapers pointed back at France, insisting the disease had blown in from the battlefields. One name that circulated was the Soldier of Naples, after a popular song. In Poland they called it the Bolshevik disease. In Senegal it was the Brazilian flu. In Brazil it was the German flu. In Germany some soldiers called it the Flanders fever. Everybody blamed somebody else, which when you think about it is also a pretty human response to a catastrophe that nobody wanted to own. But here is what I find most remarkable about this whole chapter of the story, this part about the military and the troop ships and the spread of the virus across 2 continents. It was not malice, it was not stupidity, it was not even really negligence. It was the impossible weight of a choice between 2 genuine crises. General Peyton March was not a villain. He was a man staring at a war that had already killed millions of people, watching Germany make one last desperate push, knowing that the arrival of American troops was the only thing standing between the Allies and a catastrophic collapse. He chose the war, and the virus patient indifferent, requiring nothing more than proximity and breath, simply went along for the ride. By the summer of 1918 it had circled the entire globe. Russia, North Africa, India, China, Japan, the Philippines, the islands of the Pacific. Wherever the ships went, the flu followed. And then something happened that nobody expected. It came back. Worse. There is a detail I keep returning to whenever I think about this chapter of the story. Something an army pathologist did in September of 1918 almost as an afterthought. When a young soldier named James Down died at Camp Upton on Long Island just days after falling ill, the pathologist who performed the autopsy clipped a small piece of the soldier's lung tissue, preserved it in paraffin wax and sent it to the Army Medical Museum. He probably did not think much of it at the time. It was routine practice. That tissue sample sat in storage for 80 years. In 1999, scientists recovered it, and what they found inside that preserved piece of lung, the genetic fingerprint of the 1918 virus, helped modern researchers finally understand what they'd been dealing with all those decades later. A young soldier's death in 1918 became 8 decades later a key that unlocked one of the great medical mysteries of the 20th century. History has a way of doing that, of circling back, of making the forgotten speak again. And speaking of things coming back, the virus that swept through those troop ships in the spring of 1918, the version that put 3/4 of the French army in bed and gave 900,000 German soldiers fevers, that was just the warm-up. What arrived in August and September of 1918 was a different beast entirely, and the way it moved through cities, through households, through the lives of ordinary people who'd absolutely no idea what was coming for them, is a story all its own. There is particular cruelty in false hope. Not the dramatic, obvious kind of cruelty, not a storm you can see coming from miles away. The quiet kind. The kind that arrives as relief, as exhaled breath, as someone saying finally the worst is over. That is exactly what happened in the summer of 1918. By May and June of that year, the first wave of flu had swept through military camps, raced across the Atlantic, touched Europe, and then seemingly retreated. Cases dropped. The fever quieted. Life began to feel ordinary again in a way that people had nearly forgotten was possible. Soldiers still wrote home about the mud in the trenches, factory workers still clocked their long hours, families still gathered around the dinner table. The flu, oh, that thing from spring. That was mostly gone now. In late July and early August of 1918, public health reports showed what looked like the tail end of an epidemic. Medical officers breathed easier, newspaper editors moved on to other stories, and somewhere in Europe, probably in the trenches of the Western Front, probably in the dense, airless conditions of military camps where 50,000 men lived, shoulder to shoulder the virus was doing something nobody could see. It was changing, Now, I want to be honest with you here because I think honesty is important when we are talking about science and history at the same time. 100 years later, scientists still debate exactly what happened between the first and second waves. Some researchers believe the virus genuinely mutated into a deadlier strain during the summer of 1918. Others argue it was essentially the same virus but moving through a different kind of population, one that was more crowded, more malnourished, more run down after 4 years of war. The truth is probably somewhere in both. The distinguished historian John Barry, who wrote what many consider the definitive book on the 1918 pandemic, believes the evidence strongly suggests it was the same viral strain, but one that had been passaging through human bodies repeatedly, adapting, learning, growing more efficient at what it did. Think of it like a craftsman who starts out rough and unpolished, and over months of practice develops a precision that is almost frightening. What emerged in late August of 1918 was that precision. The second wave announced itself without ceremony. On August 27, 1918, Navy surgeons in Boston recorded 3 cases of a strange severe respiratory illness at Commonwealth Pier. By August 29th, there were 58 cases. By the end of September, the city of Boston was overwhelmed simultaneously, and this is one of the details that still sends a chill through epidemiologists when they study it. This same mutated strain appeared at almost exactly the same moment in Brest, France and Freetown, Sierra Leone. 3 ports on 3 different continents separated by thousands of miles of ocean, lighting up at the same time like candles touched by the same match. The virus had seeded itself globally during the mild first wave. Now with the new strain, all those seeds erupted at once, and this time it was different in every way that mattered. The first wave had what doctors called a fairly normal mortality curve. The old, the very young, the already sick, those were the ones who did not survive. Sad, yes. Expected, yes. The kind of toll that every flu season extracts from the most vulnerable. The second wave drew a shape that nobody had ever seen before on a mortality graph. Epidemiologists call it a W curve. On a chart it looks like the letter W with peaks on both the left side representing the very old and the right side representing the very young. Every flu season makes that shape. But in the fall of 1918, something extraordinary appeared in the middle of that curve, a third peak. Right around age 27, a spike of deaths among the strongest, healthiest adults in the population. In October of 1918 alone, one single month, approximately 292,000 Americans died. Let me put that next to something for scale. In the entire preceding year of 1915, the United States recorded roughly 26,000 flu deaths in the same autumn months. The second wave killed 11 times that number in just October. 11 times. The medical establishment, already strained by years of wartime service, looked at those numbers, and by the accounts of doctors and nurses who were there, felt something close to panic. Not the loud, visible kind of panic. The quiet, professional kind, where your hands keep moving but your mind is screaming. What did the second wave actually feel like to the people living through it? Here is something I have come back to many times, and it sits with me in a way that is hard to fully articulate. The disease arrived fast, terrifyingly fast. Army Medical Officer George Soper, who studied the epidemic closely, wrote that the onset was so sudden that patients could often identify the exact moment they fell ill. 1 hour you were walking down the street perfectly fine. 90 minutes later, you were in a hospital bed with 104-degree fever, unable to lift your head from the pillow. People collapsed on streetcars, men fell at their workbenches, women fainted on their way to the market. There are documented accounts of people who sat down on park benches to rest for a moment and could not get up again. The novelist Catherine Ann Porter, who survived a severe case of the flu that autumn, and later fictionalized her experience in her novella Pale Rider, described feeling like she was moving through a fog so thick it had texture. She lost her fiancé to the disease while she herself was barely conscious. The newspaper where she worked in Denver had prepared her obituary. She recovered barely and wrote one of the only serious American literary works that honestly confronted what those weeks felt like from the inside. Most people who lived through it, Porter later observed, did not write about it at all. They could not find the words. Or perhaps they found the words and then decided not to use them. Now here is a question worth sitting with for a moment. Why does a virus become more or less deadly over time, and why specifically does it sometimes spare the person who caught it in the spring, but destroy the person who catches it in the fall? Part of the answer has to do with something called immune memory. The people who survived the first mild wave of the spring had their immune systems primed and ready. When the second wave arrived, their bodies already recognized the general shape of the enemy and could mount a response faster. Not perfect protection, but enough in many cases to be the difference. The people who had been lucky enough to avoid the spring wave entirely, their immune systems were meeting this thing cold. But the deeper answer, the one that I think about when I consider the sheer brutality of the second wave, involves something more unsettling. The conditions of late 1918 in Europe and America were almost purpose-built to help the virus do its worst work. Soldiers in the trenches were malnourished and sleep-deprived. Civilians in cities were crowded into tenements and factories. Medical resources had been drained to the war effort for 4 years. Nurses were exhausted. Doctors were dead or serving overseas. And critically, people were moving, constantly moving. Troops rotating between the front and rest camps, supply workers travelling between ports and cities, families taking trains to visit sick relatives. In the fall of 1918, human mobility was a feature of the war, not a bug, and the virus turned every single journey into a vector. The third wave, which arrived in the winter of 1918 and stretched into the spring of 1919, was quieter. Still deadly still, claiming lives by the tens of thousands, but the savage, almost incomprehensible lethality of that October had passed. There is a grim irony in when the third wave arrived and how it spread. November the 11th, 1918. The war ended. In cities across America and Europe, people poured into the streets. They embraced strangers. They kissed. They cheered. After 4 years of misery and fear and loss, the guns finally went silent and humanity celebrated in the most human way possible, by pressing together, breathing on each other, sharing the intoxicating air of relief. Within days, the flu was moving again. Cities that had managed to keep the second wave somewhat contained now saw a resurgence. Demobilizing soldiers carried the virus home in their kit bags tucked invisibly beside their letters and their photographs and their memories of the front. The third wave followed the troops home the same way the first wave had followed them overseas. Looking back at all 3 waves together, the deceptively mild spring, the catastrophic autumn and the grinding winter, I keep coming back to one thing that strikes me as the most human element of the entire story. People kept being surprised, not because they were foolish, not because they were not paying attention, but because hope is one of the most powerful forces in human psychology, and every time the numbers dipped, every time a city saw fewer deaths for a week, every time a medical officer issued a cautiously optimistic report, people believed it. They wanted it to be true, and so they acted as though it were true. The summer of 1918, that quiet interlude between the first and second waves, was not a moment of ignorance. It was a moment of desperate, deeply understandable wishful thinking. And the virus, which operates entirely outside the realm of hope and fear, simply waited. 3 waves, 3 different personalities, 3 different relationships with the human body and the human world around it. But here is what none of those waves changed, not for a single day, the lived experience of the people inside them. The men and women who had to keep going to work, who had to feed their children, who had to figure out what to do when the doctor was sick and the hospital was full and the pharmacy was out of everything. What did daily life actually look like for an ordinary American family in the fall of 1918? What did a mother do when she could not afford to stop working, even as her neighborhood emptied one house at a time? What did a young man think watching the strongest people he knew fall first? That is the question that pulls us forward now, and the answer is more complicated and more heartbreaking than almost anything you might expect. At some point during the autumn of 1918, a physician at the United States Naval Hospital in Philadelphia sat down and wrote something that has stayed with me ever since I came across it. He was documenting the patients he was seeing every day, and he wrote with what you can only imagine was a kind of disbelieving exhaustion that most of the people dying in front of him were between the ages of 20 and 26. And that they were, and this is the part that clearly troubled him most, in unusually good physical condition. Read that again slowly. In unusually good physical condition. Not the elderly, not the frail, not the sick who had been sick for years. The strongest people in the room. The ones with the best immune systems. The ones who by every measure medicine had at its disposal should have been the last to die. This single fact that 1918 targeted the young and the strong with particular ferocity is the mystery that has haunted scientists, historians and doctors for over a century. And the answer, when it finally emerged decades later, turned out to be one of the most counterintuitive things in all of medical history. Let me set the scene of what doctors were watching from their hospital beds in those terrible October weeks. A patient would arrive walking under their own power. Feverish, yes. Complaining of a headache and aching bones the way anyone complains of the flu, but walking, talking, insisting the way the young always insist that they would be fine. Hours later, something changed. A bluish tint would appear at the tips of their fingers. Then it spread slowly at first, then faster up their hands, their arms across their face. Their lips turned the colour of bruises. Physicians at the time called it cyanosis, the skin's visible signal that the blood was running out of oxygen. In some patients it spread so fast and so completely that, as Dr. Roy Grist at Camp Devons had already written in his letter, it became, and I am paraphrasing carefully here, difficult to distinguish one patient from another at a glance. British military doctors performing autopsies on soldiers who had died of the 1918 flu described what they found in the lungs, and they reached for a comparison they knew intimately from 4 years of trench warfare. The damage, they said, resembled the effects of chemical weapons. The lungs of a healthy 25-year-old, destroyed the way mustard gas destroyed tissue, by their own body. It took decades and the tools of modern molecular biology for scientists to understand what was actually happening inside those lungs. The process is called a cytokine storm, and it works something like this. When the 1918 influenza virus entered the lungs, the immune system responded the way it is supposed to. It sent chemical messengers called cytokines racing to the site of the infection to trigger inflammation and recruit defenders. This is normal. This is what a healthy immune system does. The stronger the immune system, the faster and more forceful this response. But in certain patients specifically, those with the most robust, most energetic immune systems, the response did not stop at the right moment. The cytokines kept flooding in. More and more chemical signals, more and more inflammation, until the very defenders that were supposed to save the lungs began destroying the tissue instead. The fluid accumulated. The airways closed. The patient who had walked in that morning now could not draw a breath. In 1918, nobody knew this was happening. Nobody had words for it. Nobody could explain why the people who seemed most likely to survive were the ones who did not. One physician from Virginia documented his bewilderment in writing. He said that a large percentage of the patients he was losing were young men who appeared at admission to be healthy and vigorous. Healthy and vigorous. The novelist Thomas Wolfe, in his semi-autobiographical work Look Homeward Angel, wrote a scene in which a mother watches her strong, robust son fall to the flu and says simply, "It seems to get the big, strong ones first." She was right. She just could not have known why. Here is where the story takes another unexpected turn, one that adds a layer of tragic irony that I honestly find almost impossible to shake. Scientists studying the specific age peak of mortality in 1918, that haunting spike centered right around age 27 or 28, noticed something curious when they traced the birth years backward. People who were 27 or 28 in 1918 were born around 1889 or 1890, and 1889 to 1890 was, you may already see where this is going, the year of the Russian flu pandemic. A global influenza epidemic swept the world in those years, and the children who were infants during that time, the babies who survived, who grew up, who became the healthy young adults of 1918, had their immune systems permanently shaped by that early exposure. Their bodies had built a specific kind of memory around that older flu strain. But the 1918 virus was different enough that when those immune systems encountered it, the old memory did not help them fight it cleanly. Instead, it may have caused their immune response to misfire, recognizing the general shape of an old enemy and overreacting with everything they had. The very thing that was supposed to protect them became the thing that overwhelmed them. I want to pause here for a moment because I think this deserves more than a footnote. We're talking about a generation of people who survived the Russian flu as infants, who did not even have conscious memory of it, and who were then, 28 years later, made more vulnerable by the invisible mark that survival had left on their biology. History reaching backward through time to claim lives in the future. Now I want to bring this down from the biological to the human, because as fascinating as the science is, and it truly is what matters most, is what this particular pattern of death actually meant for real families living through it in real time. In 1918, a 27-year-old man was in most cases the centre of gravity of his household. He was the one working, the one earning, the one who fixed things, who paid the rent, who carried the weight of a family's survival on shoulders that had until that October never given him reason to doubt they could bear it. And when those men fell sometimes, within 24 hours of the first sneeze they left behind a silence that was not just emotional, but economic, immediate and catastrophic. The historian Alfred Crosby described it plainly. Many families, he wrote, especially in the poorer neighbourhoods, had no adult well enough to prepare food, and in some cases had no food at all, because the breadwinner was sick or in the worst cases already gone. Read that slowly too, no food at all. Not struggling, not difficult. No food. I want to tell you about a family named Burinescu. Jacob Burinescu was 39 years old in October of 1918. An immigrant from Romania who had come to New York City back in 1900 at the age of 19. The classic immigrant story, really arriving with almost nothing, building something from nothing. He ran a steam cleaning and pressing business from the basement of a building on Orchard Street on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, a neighborhood that hummed at all hours with the overlapping languages and ambitions of people who had crossed oceans to be there. Jacob was also an amateur actor. He loved Yiddish theatre. Many of his customers trusted him to clean their costumes. He was by every account that survived him a man full of life. He died at home from flu-related complications in October of 1918, at the very peak of the epidemic in New York City. His wife Sarah was pregnant with their sixth child when he died. She slipped into a deep depression after losing him. Her family worried about her health and the health of the baby she was carrying. Their daughter Jacqueline was born in January of 1919, several months after her father's death. She would never meet him, Everything she ever knew about Jacob came through her mother's memories, her siblings' stories, fragments of a person she could never fully hold. Sarah Brunescu, who'd been a wife and mother, became overnight the sole earner for 6 children. She went to work as a sewing machine operator in the garment industry, and kept the family together through years that must have required a kind of quiet, daily heroism that never gets a monument built in its honor. This story is not famous. Jacob Brunescu does not appear in history books. But his family's experience is in miniature the story of thousands and thousands of families across the United States that autumn. And here is the part that a historian once pointed out that stopped me cold. An early chronicler of the 1918 pandemic wrote something that cuts to the bone when you let it fully land. Spanish influenza, he observed, characteristically killed young adults and therefore rarely killed men in positions of great authority, which meant, in the cold logic of how history decides what gets remembered, there was no one famous enough, powerful enough, prominent enough among the dead to force the world to remember them. The victims were young, many were poor, many were immigrants, many were workers whose names appeared only in death records, if at all. They were replaced, yes, that was actually the word used at the time, by people who should have known better, rapidly replaced in the workforce. You can rebuild a factory floor, you cannot rebuild a father. There is one more piece of this that I find deeply human, almost unbearably so. In many households where the husband or father died, the children were by custom and necessity suddenly repositioned in ways they had not chosen and were not prepared for. A 12-year-old boy who lost his father to the flu in 1918 might be told sometimes the very week of the funeral that he was now the man of the family, that he needed to find work. One account describes a boy named Frank whose father's health collapsed after a severe case of flu and who died 2 years later from the long-term damage it had done to his heart. When the news came, Frank was 12 years old. He described feeling like his world had tumbled in, and then a week after burying his father, he went to work. His childhood ended in a week. These are the stories the pandemic left behind, not the fever charts, not the mortality statistics. These. So the next time someone tells you that 1918 killed the strong and the healthy, understand that this is only partly true. It killed the young. It killed people at the precise moment in their lives when they were holding the most weight, most responsible for the most people, most necessary to the most fragile. And in doing so, it did not just take lives, it unmade families. And the families that remained, the widows, the orphans, the 12-year-olds going to work, they carried that weight forward into a future they had to build largely alone. Which brings us naturally to the world those families were navigating every single day, the streets they walked, the rules that suddenly governed where they could go and what they could touch, and the extraordinary measures cities took and failed to take as an invisible enemy moved house to house with terrifying ease. Picture 2 cities, same country, same virus, same autumn of 1918. One of them held a parade, the other one didn't. That single difference, one decision made by 2 different men in 2 different offices, produced results so staggering that epidemiologists still teach this story today as one of the clearest demonstrations in all of public health history of what leadership can mean when a city is staring down a catastrophe it barely understands. Let's start in Philadelphia, because I think you need to feel the full weight of what happened there before you can appreciate what happened everywhere else. By the middle of September 1918, the flu was already burning through Philadelphia's Navy Yard. Sailors were sick. Naval commanders were alarmed. Local physicians had begun making urgent private appeals to the city's public health director, a man named Wilmer Cruzen, asking him to cancel the massive Liberty Loan Parade scheduled for September 28th. The parade was designed to raise war bonds, Philadelphia had been tasked with raising $259 million for the war effort, and city officials saw the parade as their best opportunity. Hundreds of thousands of people were expected to line the streets: Boy Scouts, marching bands, floats. John Philip Sousa was set to lead one of the bands. The doctors who pleaded with Cruzen to cancel it chose their words carefully, in the way that people speaking to a man who has the power to ignore them often do. One physician described the planned gathering as, and I am paraphrasing closely, a ready-made inflammable mass for a conflagration. Cruzen let the parade proceed. On the morning of September 28, 1918, 200,000 Philadelphians poured into the streets of Broad Street. The actual attendance was 20 times higher than city officials had originally projected. People pressed against each other for 2 miles. They cheered. They breathed on each other. They reached past each other to catch glimpses of the floats. The virus, which asks nothing of its host except proximity, was having an exceptional day. What followed is one of the most documented cascades of consequence in American public health history. Within 72 hours of the parade, every bed in all 31 of Philadelphia's hospitals was filled. Every single one. Within a single week, 4,500 Philadelphians were dead, and 47,000 more were infected. On a single day in October, the 17th, 759 people died in the city. One day, the city's morgue, which had been built to hold 36 bodies at a time, was overwhelmed beyond any capacity to manage. I want you to sit with the testimony of a child named Selma Epp, who was a young girl during the epidemic and who recalled decades later watching the collection of the dead in her neighborhood. The strongest person in her family, she said, carried her 2-year-old brother's body out to the sidewalk. Everyone was too weak to protest. There were no coffins in the wagon that came, just bodies piled on top of each other. No coffins, bodies in a wagon, in an American city in 1918. The casket shortage was partly because most of the coffins manufactured in Philadelphia had already been commandeered by the government to bury soldiers killed in the war in Europe. The living were competing with the dead of another catastrophe for the means to bury their own. Public school kitchens were converted into soup kitchens. Churches donated their buildings. Wealthy women organized telephone banks to route callers toward whatever medical help still existed. Catholic nuns from the archdiocese walked into the most marginalized neighborhoods in the city, including African American communities that the segregated hospitals would not admit, and provided care with their own hands when no one else would. And through all of this, and this is the part that I find most difficult to reconcile, Wilmer Cruzen kept issuing optimistic statements. When daily deaths hit 200, he announced that the peak of the epidemic had been reached. When they hit 300, he called it the high water mark. The peak death count in a single day was 711 reached on October 17th, before the numbers finally began to ease. By the time Philadelphia's epidemic subsided, more than 12,000 people were dead. Some accounts put the final toll at closer to 17,000. For what it's worth, there is no memorial to the victims of the 1918 flu anywhere in the city of Philadelphia today. There is a museum exhibition, but no memorial now. St. Louis, Missouri. October the 5th, 1918. 1 week after Philadelphia's parade. The flu had just been identified in the civilian population of St. Louis, which was at that time one of the 10 largest cities in the United States. The city's health commissioner, a man named Max Starkloff, did not wait for instructions from above. He did not consult with politicians about the optics of disrupting wartime morale. He did not hold meetings to weigh the economic impact on local businesses. Within 2 days of the first confirmed civilian cases, Starkloff signed a proclamation with the mayor closing every public gathering space in the city, schools, churches, movie theatres, pool halls, cabarets, dance halls, Sunday schools, funerals, open-air meetings, all of it shuttered immediately. The Archbishop of St. Louis announced that the closures would suspend the religious obligation of Catholics to attend Mass on Sundays for as long as the order remained in force. That is a significant thing to announce in a heavily Catholic city in an era when weekly Mass attendance was simply part of how life was structured. But the Archbishop backed the measure. Business owners complained. Of course they did. But Starkloff and the mayor held their ground. The result: according to a landmark 2007 analysis published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, one of the most rigorous studies ever done on the 1918 response, the peak weekly mortality rate in St. Louis was 31 deaths per 100,000 people. In Philadelphia at its worst, it was 257 deaths per 100,000 people. The same virus, the same country, the same autumn. Philadelphia's peak death rate was more than 8 times higher than St. Louis's. 8 times. I have thought about this ratio many times. 8 times. Because of 2 men in 2 offices making 2 different choices on roughly the same day. Here is where I want to offer a thought that I think history sometimes glosses over, because it is easier to cast Wilma Cruzen as simply a villain and Max Starkloff as simply a hero. Cruzen was working inside an almost impossible set of pressures. The United States was at war. The federal government had been pushing the Liberty Loan campaign hard. Newspapers were not fully reporting on the epidemic because wartime censorship, not of the illegal kind, but of the reflexive patriotic kind, had shaped what editors considered appropriate to publish. And on the eve of the parade, there were only a handful of confirmed civilian cases in Philadelphia. The catastrophe that was about to unfold was not in the strict hindsight-free sense of the word entirely predictable. Starkloff, on the other hand, had something Cruzen lacked. He was not a political appointee. He was a career public health professional. He had credibility, institutional trust, and the kind of slow-built authority that lets a person make an unpopular decision and have it stick. He had earned the right to say no, and when the moment came, he used it. The lesson I take from this is not that Cruzen was a fool. The lesson is that the structures we build around expertise, the things that allow experts to speak and be heard at the exact moment when speaking up costs the most, those structures matter. They matter when there is no crisis so that they will hold when there is one. St. Louis, as it turned out, was not entirely spared from learning this lesson itself. By early November, the numbers in St. Louis had stayed low enough that the city grew confident. Starkloff reopened schools in mid-November. Theatres and churches followed. Citizens breathed a collective sigh of relief that was probably well earned given what they had managed to avoid. And then in early December the flu came back. Schools that reopened in mid-November reported a sharp rise in cases among children almost immediately. They were closed again. By December 3rd, the epidemic peaked in St. Louis for the second time this time, with nearly 1,500 new cases in a single day. Deaths peaked at 58 per day a week later. A 2007 analysis calculated that if St. Louis had retained all of its public health restrictions through the spring, instead of lifting them in November, the city could have reduced its overall death toll by an estimated 90%. 90%. They did not, of course, because no one knew. They were doing the best they could with what they had, which was incomplete information, a terrified population, enormous economic pressure, and a disease nobody fully understood yet. This is what I keep coming back to whenever I study the city-by-city response to the 1918 flu. Every single decision, whether to close, whether to reopen, whether to cancel a parade or hold one, was made in real time, without the retrospective clarity of knowing what came next. These were not hypotheticals. They were choices made by real human beings under conditions of genuine uncertainty, and the consequences of those choices were written in the deaths of real people. And across all of these cities, something else was happening that is easy to overlook when you are focused on the mortality statistics. Daily life had become almost unrecognizable. Streets that were normally packed with the noise and energy of American urban life in 1918, the streetcar bells, the vendors, the children on their way to school, the women shopping, the men heading to work went quiet. Not silent because cities are never truly silent, but muffled, reduced, hollowed out. In some neighborhoods, the only people visibly moving were the nurses making house calls and the wagons coming to collect the dead. Businesses that had managed to stay open imposed strange new rituals. Barbers in Cincinnati wore gauze masks. Grocery clerks took orders from customers who stood outside and slid notes through gaps in the door afraid to enter. Department stores in St. Louis had police officers stationed inside to prevent people from lingering. The simple act of browsing for a shirt had become in the span of a few weeks a potential act of harm. Churches that were still open in the cities that had not yet closed them held services where the pews were deliberately spaced out and the collection plates were not passed by hand. The singing of hymns was discouraged in some congregations because communal singing in a confined space turned out to be one of the most effective ways to spread a respiratory illness. Even the act of praising together had to be rationed. Telephone operators worked double shifts in many cities, routing calls from panicked families to whatever medical help remained. In some exchanges, the operators themselves were so depleted by illness that the phone systems functioned only partially. The infrastructure of daily connection, the way people reached each other in an era before the internet, before mobile phones, was fraying at the edges. And through all of it, an ordinary Tuesday still felt from a certain distance like an ordinary Tuesday. The mail came, the trains ran somewhat. Factories that were considered essential to the war effort remained open because steel and ammunition and uniforms were still needed, and the calculus of wartime demanded that production continue even as the workforce coughed and shivered at their stations. I find that image, the factory running, the workers sick, the foreman too ill to enforce anything, almost unbearably human. Life's machinery grinding forward even as the people operating it were disappearing one by one. The story of how cities responded to the 1918 flu is at its core a story about how human institutions behave under pressure they were not designed to withstand. Some bent and held, some shattered. Most did a little of both in ways that nobody could have predicted and that nobody could entirely control. But in all of those cities, whether they acted fast or slow, whether their leaders were brave or cowardly, there was one thing happening inside people's homes, away from the public eye, that the mortality statistics and the public health ordinances cannot fully capture: the masks people were wearing on the outside, and the fight happening inside between medicine and desperation, between science and fear, between the strange remedies of an age that did not yet know what a virus was, and the extraordinary nurses who stood between patients and death with nothing but their own exhausted competence. That is where we are going next. There is a song from 1918 that I think about sometimes. It was written specifically to encourage people to comply with San Francisco's new mask ordinance, and the lyrics, if you can believe it, went something like this: "Obey the laws and wear the gauze. Protect your jaws from septic pores." I want you to sit with that for a moment. Someone in the middle of the deadliest pandemic in modern history wrote a jingle about gauze and septic pores. That tells you something important about the spirit of the age, the way that even in genuine catastrophe, human beings reach for humor, for catchy phrases, for the tools of ordinary persuasion. Because you cannot simply order a population to accept a new reality. You have to sell it to them. And in 1918, the selling of masks was one of the most fascinating, frustrating, and surprisingly revealing social dramas of the entire epidemic. Let's start with what a mask actually was in 1918 because it matters enormously to the story. Today, when we imagine a protective mask, we're probably thinking of something specifically engineered, multiple filtration layers, a precise seal around the nose and bridge. Nothing like that existed in 1918. The standard surgical mask of the era was made of 4 layers of gauze, the same loose-woven cotton fabric you might use to dress a wound. It was held in place by strings tied behind the ears or knotted at the back of the head, and it typically covered from the bridge of the nose to just below the chin. That was it. A medical historian examining preserved examples of these masks noted that they were, in her words, pretty transparent. You could see light through them with no difficulty. The Detroit Health Commissioner at the time, a man named J.W. Inches, publicly stated that gauze was too porous to prevent the spread of influenza among the general public. He was not entirely wrong, but he was also not entirely right. Because the real story of masks in 1918 is not a story about filtration efficiency, a concept most people in 1918 would not have understood anyway. It is a story about behavior compliance politics, and what happens when a frightened society is asked to change the most ordinary aspects of how it moves through the world, and is given only an imperfect tool to do it with. San Francisco entered this story in a particular way. On October 22, 1918, Mayor James Rolfe signed what became known as the Mask Ordinance, making San Francisco the first city in the United States to require face coverings in public spaces. The ordinance specified 4 layers of gauze at minimum. Violations carried a fine of $5, which is roughly $80 in today's money or 10 days in jail. The Red Cross launched an awareness campaign alongside it. Posters went up across the city. The campaign's boldest claim, printed on materials distributed citywide, read, "Wear a mask and save your life. A mask is 99% proof against influenza." 99%. That was a number someone invented or wildly extrapolated or hoped into existence. There was no clinical evidence for it. But in October of 1918, with people falling sick and dying at terrifying speed, perhaps a little optimistic arithmetic was forgivable. The initial response was remarkable. By the time the ordinance officially went into force, the San Francisco Chronicle reported that 4 out of every 5 residents were already wearing masks voluntarily. Churches organized mass sewing sessions. Red Cross chapters across the city churned out gauze masks by the thousands. The women running these operations had already been keeping the city's volunteer medical networks together for weeks. Now they added mask manufacturing to their list of responsibilities, as if it were simply another item on an already extraordinary to-do list. And for a few weeks it worked. Or at least it appeared to work. Cases and deaths in San Francisco declined through late October and early November. But here is where it gets interesting. Because even in those early weeks of high compliance, the mask story was already developing the kind of human texture that makes it so compelling to look back on. In Phoenix, Arizona, where most residents apparently complied with the local mask order, some men found a creative workaround. They cut holes in their gauze masks to accommodate their cigars. They were still technically wearing a mask. The mask was just now a frame for an unobstructed opening directly in front of their mouths. They were arrested. But not before presumably someone wrote a ticket with a completely straight face. In San Francisco itself, the city's leading physician, Dr. William Hassler, was photographed at a boxing match alongside the mayor, several city supervisors, a congressman, a Navy rear admiral, and a justice of the courts. None of them were wearing masks. A police photographer present at the event sent copies of the prints to his chief for further action. Hassler paid a $5 fine on the spot and told reporters that his mask may have, quote, dropped a bit while he was smoking a cigar. The mayor was fined $50 several days later, when a photograph of his unmasked face was presented to his own police chief by his own department. The mayor of San Francisco was fined for not wearing a mask by the police department that reported to the mayor of San Francisco. I find this detail somehow endlessly charming, even accounting for the circumstances. Meanwhile, a journalist named Alma Whitaker, writing in the Los Angeles Times in October of that year, offered a dispatch from inside a fine restaurant where the new masking rules applied. She described the scene as the funniest sight, all the waiters and diners masked each diner, just raising their screen to pop in a mouthful of food. Whitaker herself had declined to wear a mask on an outing, and had been, in her words, forcibly taken by Red Cross volunteers to a nearby station where she was ordered to construct a mask and put it on before being released. The mask, it turned out, had become a mirror. It reflected something back at people about authority, about compliance, about what we owe each other in a crisis, and about the deeply human tendency to test every rule for the gap between what is required and what is merely expected. On November 21st, 1918, exactly 10 days after Armistice Day ended the World War I, a whistle blew across San Francisco at noon. The streets erupted. People tore the masks from their faces. They threw them to the ground and stamped on them. The San Francisco Chronicle described scenes of genuine jubilation, men and women breathing open air for the first time in weeks, laughing, hugging. Requests by the health department to please conserve the gauze as it might still be needed went completely unheeded. The masks were gone. Mayor Rolfe had annulled the ordinance the previous day, judging the epidemic to be sufficiently under control. The epidemic was not, as it turned out, sufficiently under control. By early January of 1919, flu cases in San Francisco were surging again. On January 10th alone, 600 new cases were reported in the city. The Board of Supervisors voted 15-1 to reinstate the mask mandate. This time the reaction was completely different. The first ordinance had been passed in wartime when the public health campaign was wrapped in the language of patriotism. As one Red Cross poster had put it, the man or woman or child who will not wear a mask now is a dangerous slacker. In a country still mobilized for war, the accusation of being a slacker carried genuine social weight. People wore masks partly out of civic duty, and partly because the alternative was to be publicly branded a coward. But by January of 1919 the war was over. The language of patriotism no longer applied, and in its absence what remained was simply a government telling people to cover their faces. Again. Within days of the second ordinance, a group of San Francisco residents formed an organization they called the Anti-Mask League. The name alone is extraordinary. Not the "we prefer not to wear masks" club, not the "let's discuss the science association," the Anti-Mask League. It sounds like a society of Victorian villains, but the people who founded it were by any reasonable measure entirely ordinary. The president of the Anti-Mask League was a woman named Mrs. E.C. Harrington. She was a lawyer, a suffragette who had worked for women's right to vote in California, and a seasoned public speaker. Her fellow officers in the league were also women. The membership included a handful of physicians, at least one member of the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, and a cross-section of business owners whose livelihoods had been hollowing out for months under various closure orders. On January the 25th, 1919, the Anti-Mask League held a public rally at a venue called the Dreamland Rink. Approximately 4,500 people showed up. 4,500 people to protest a mask. Now, I want to be careful here because history has not been uniformly kind to the Anti-Mask League, and that judgment is not entirely wrong. They were protesting a public health measure during an active pandemic. Some of their arguments that masks were ineffective, that the evidence was insufficient, that the mandate was unconstitutional, were a mixture of genuine uncertainty and motivated reasoning. in roughly the proportions you would expect from a group of people who were exhausted, frightened, and deeply tired of being told what to do. But I also think the people who gathered at the Dreamland rink deserved to be understood rather than simply condemned. They had been living in a state of managed emergency for months. Their businesses had been opened and closed again. They had buried people they loved. They had complied with one ordinance, seen it lifted, and were now being told to comply again with something that even the scientific community of the time could not unambiguously demonstrate was working. One attendee at the Dreamland meeting was quoted in the San Francisco Chronicle as saying, "What doctors don't know about this epidemic would fill a decent-sized library, and yet they have the nerve to force us to wear masks." That quote, written in January of 1919, has a peculiar quality. It is simultaneously the complaint of someone who is wrong because the masks were at minimum reducing transmission of respiratory droplets, and also an entirely understandable expression of frustration from a person who has been living inside genuine institutional uncertainty for months. The science of 1918 was in fact incomplete in ways that even its practitioners acknowledged. No one had yet identified viruses as the cause of influenza. The masks being mandated were genuinely imperfect. The officials giving guidance had in some cases been photographed not following it themselves. The frustration was real, and it expressed itself through the only formal mechanism available, public protest. The Anti-Mask League accomplished very little, practically speaking. The mask mandate remained in force. The League's meetings grew increasingly chaotic. At its final gathering, the hall owner reportedly shut off all the lights to end the proceedings. The group dissolved without having achieved its stated objectives. On February 1st, the mask ordinance was rescinded not because of the League's protests, but because the health board determined the epidemic had sufficiently declined. What is the final verdict on whether the masks helped? The honest answer is probably yes, imperfectly, and not as much as the campaign claimed. A 1919 study concluded that the mask mandates in San Francisco had not produced a statistically clear effect on the epidemic. Medical historians writing with the benefit of a century of hindsight have been more generous, suggesting that the decline in deaths during the first mandate period can be partly attributed to masking combined with other measures. The masks made of gauze were too porous to block the virus entirely, but they likely did reduce the volume of respiratory droplets exchanged in close contact. At scale, across a city, that reduction may have mattered. What is not in dispute is the social effect. The mask campaign, the posters, the jingles, the Red Cross volunteers, the fines, the photographs of barefaced mayors being fined by their own departments, created a public language around shared responsibility that had not previously existed in quite that form. It made visible in a way that street closures could not the idea that what any individual does in a public space has consequences for the people around them. That idea, awkwardly expressed and imperfectly enforced, was genuinely new in 1918. San Francisco, for all its contradictions and its anti-mask league, and its cigar-smoking supervisors getting photographed maskless at boxing matches, ultimately ended the pandemic with about 3,500 deaths in a city of 500,000 people. The death rate per 100,000 was 673 higher than St. Louis, lower than Philadelphia. It survived, scarred, exhausted, and probably somewhat conflicted about gauze. What I find most affecting when I look at the photographs from those months is something that goes beyond the policy debates. It is the sheer strangeness of what people look like, the masked faces in the streets, the masked barbers, the masked conductors on the streetcars, the masked children photographed in rows for school pictures. A whole city changed its face, and underneath every single one of those masks was a person trying to decide in real time how much of their ordinary life they could still hold on to, and how much they had to let go and whether the letting go was actually doing anything, and whether anyone in charge actually knew. That question, whether anyone in charge actually knew, brings us to perhaps the darkest corner of the whole 1918 story. Because while citizens were debating mask materials and forming anti-mask leagues and cutting holes in their gauze for their cigars, something else was happening at the level of government and official communication that shaped the entire public experience of the pandemic in ways that most people living through it could not see. This silence, the management of information, the deliberate shaping of what was known and not known, reported and not reported. That is the story coming up next, and it is in some ways the most troubling chapter of everything we have covered. Somewhere in the late autumn of 1918, a small newspaper in Wisconsin called the Jefferson County Union ran a story. The story was not dramatic. It did not call for revolution or accuse anyone of treason. What it did was suggest that the influenza spreading across the United States might be more serious than official sources were letting on. The United States Army prosecuted the paper for it. The charge essentially was that reporting an honest assessment of a public health crisis constituted an act of disloyalty to the war effort. The editors had written the truth, and the truth had been ruled a threat to national morale. I find this detail to be one of the most revealing facts of the entire 1918 pandemic, because it tells you with great precision what the architecture of silence surrounding this epidemic was actually built from. It was not built primarily from lies. It was built from something more insidious, the transformation of truth itself into a category of harm. To understand how this happened, you have to go back 1 year before the pandemic began. In April of 1917, the United States entered the First World War. Within weeks, President Woodrow Wilson signed the Espionage Act, a law making it a federal crime to interfere with military operations or willfully cause insubordination in the armed forces. The following year, Congress passed an amendment known as the Sedition Act. This one went further. It made it unlawful to utter, print, write, or publish any disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the form of government of the United States. Think about what that means in practice. Any language the government deemed disloyal, profane, abusive. The definitions were as elastic as the government needed them to be. More than 2,100 individuals were prosecuted under these laws. Eugene Debs, a widely respected socialist politician, was sentenced to 10 years in prison for a speech he gave against the war. Charles Schenck, General Secretary of the Socialist Party, was jailed for distributing pamphlets. The Supreme Court upheld both sentences. The Espionage Act, the court ruled, superseded the First Amendment when a clear and present danger existed, and the government's interpretation of what constituted such a danger was in practice extremely broad. Now here is where things become genuinely dangerous for the story of the flu. The Sedition Act was passed in May of 1918. The second wave of the flu, the deadly one, arrived in August of 1918. These two events were almost perfectly synchronized. The most comprehensive censorship apparatus in American peacetime history was fully in place at exactly the moment the most lethal phase of the pandemic was beginning. If there was ever a time when that coincidence needed to be examined carefully, 1918 was it. The newspapers, for the most part, understood which way the wind was blowing, and in 1918 newspapers were distributed through the mail. The Postmaster General, a man named Albert Burleson, was one of the most aggressive enforcers of the Sedition Act, and he made clear that any publication printing material deemed harmful to morale risked losing its mailing privileges. In an era before radio was widespread, losing your mailing permit was not simply a legal inconvenience. It was effectively a death sentence for your publication. The result was not in most cases overt government instruction telling editors what to suppress. It was something quieter, and in some ways more damaging self-censorship. Editors made their own calculations about what was safe to print. And those calculations consistently produced the same outcome: a softening of flu coverage, a tilt toward reassurance, and a relentless subordination of the pandemic to war news. If you had picked up a major Boston newspaper on October 4th, 1918, a day when the city's hospitals were already overwhelmed and cases were exploding, you would have found war news dominating the front page. The British breaking through German lines, Austria making overtures toward peace. The flu was there present in modest one-column articles carefully framed. One headline read, "No gain on the epidemic in Boston," which was honest enough but followed immediately by reassurance that health authorities were encouraged the increase was only small. 191 people had died in Boston the previous day. That fact was present in the article. But the framing around it worked quietly to keep the full weight of what was happening from landing on the reader. And when Philadelphia's doctors tried to use the press to warn citizens that the upcoming Liberty Loan Parade was unsafe, newspaper editors refused to publish their letters. The warnings existed. They simply had nowhere to go. And what of the president himself? Woodrow Wilson never made a single public statement about the 1918 influenza pandemic. Not one. Historians have searched the record extensively. Sandra Opdyke, writing in her study of the flu epidemic, concluded that researchers had been unable to find a single occasion on which Wilson mentioned it in public. John Barry, whose book The Great Influenza is the definitive account of the pandemic, put it plainly: Wilson would not shift his focus, not for an instant. The war consumed everything. Anything that might sap the nation's will to fight was simply not something Wilson would engage with publicly. And yet Wilson knew. He knew exactly how serious the disease was. People he trusted told him. They spoke to him specifically about what was happening on the troop transport ships, about soldiers boarding in good health and arriving in Europe already sick or dead. In September of 1918, just 2 days into its Atlantic crossing, the transport ship George Washington reported over 500 soldiers ill with influenza. By the time the ship reached France, 77 of them were dead. Wilson knew. He chose silence. The public health establishment followed his lead. Senior officials described the epidemic as ordinary seasonal influenza by another name. The Chicago Public Health Commissioner John Dill Robertson offered a statement that captures the official philosophy of the era with painful precision. He said it is our duty to keep the people from fear. Worry kills more people than the epidemic. At Cook County Hospital in Chicago, 40% of all influenza patients were dying. The commissioner said worry was the bigger threat. I want to engage honestly with the logic behind this position, because I think it deserves more than simple condemnation. There is a real argument that panic causes its own casualties, that population stripping pharmacies and fleeing cities create conditions that are genuinely harder to manage than the quiet continuation of daily life. Wartime governments had absorbed this lesson from the context of bombardment and naval warfare. Keep people calm, keep the machines running. Fear is contagious too. But here is exactly where the argument collapses in 1918. Because fear, when it is proportional to an actual threat, is not simply a social problem to be managed. It is information. It is the signal that tells people to stay home, to avoid the parade, to keep their children out of school, to not press their face to the cheek of a sick relative. When you suppress the information that produces appropriate fear, you're not protecting people from a psychological danger. You're stripping away their ability to protect themselves from a physical one. Have you ever thought about it that way? Fear as information. The instinct to protect people from bad news seems kind, but in a pandemic, that kindness can become the most lethal thing in the room. John Barry documented the consequence of this dynamic with uncomfortable clarity. In cities where officials maintained constant reassurance, the social fabric frayed in a particular and unexpected way. People stopped trusting what they were told. And when they stopped trusting official sources, they stopped trusting each other. Rumours filled the vacuum that the Germans had poisoned the water supply that Bayer aspirin had been deliberately contaminated. That poison gas from the mass graves of the Western Front was drifting across the Atlantic on the wind. The stories people invented to explain what they were experiencing were in many cases far more frightening than the truth would have been. Barry described the social effect in words I find genuinely haunting. Because people could not trust what they were being told, real terror gripped them so much so that society itself began to fray. It became everyone for himself. That outcome, he observed, is different from most disasters when communities come together to help each other. The suppression of truth did not keep people calm. It destroyed the foundations of the trust on which collective action in a crisis depends. There is one final chapter to this story, and it is the most extraordinary of all. In April of 1919, President Wilson travelled to Paris to negotiate the peace terms ending the First World War. He arrived with a vision, a relatively lenient settlement rooted in his 14 points, that would allow Europe to rebuild without the seeds of another catastrophic war already planted inside the peace agreement. He was the idealist at the table, outnumbered by exhausted and vengeful men from countries that had bled for 4 years. France alone had lost more than 1 million soldiers in combat. Clemenceau, the French Prime Minister, was not in any mood for leniency, and then Wilson came down with the flu. On the night of April 3rd, 1919, he began coughing violently. His physician, Carrie Grayson, was so alarmed by the severity of the attack that he wrote later he had initially been suspicious the president's food had been tampered with. Wilson ran a fever of 103 degrees. He could not sit upright in bed. And then as he began to recover, something strange happened. Wilson developed a fixation on the furniture in his rooms at the Hôtel de Prince Murat. He became convinced that pieces of furniture were being removed and replaced without his knowledge, even though nothing had moved. He accused the French government of surrounding him with spies. On 2 separate occasions, he created scenes over items he was certain had been taken, while the people around him quietly confirmed that everything was exactly where it had always been. His chief usher, Erwin Hoover, wrote afterward that something queer was happening in the president's mind, and that Wilson was never the same after this spell of sickness. David Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, came to visit Wilson during his recovery and described what he witnessed as a nervous and spiritual breakdown. What we now understand, drawing on nearly a century of subsequent neurology, is that Wilson was experiencing the neurological complications of severe influenza, a condition the medical literature of the era had already begun to document. Physicians called it post-influenzal encephalitis. Oliver Sacks wrote about its long-term survivors decades later in his book Awakenings. Symptoms included profound disorientation, paranoia, and impaired judgment following severe flu infection. Wilson exhibits every marker of this condition in the historical record. When Wilson returned to the negotiating table, he was by the accounts of everyone present not the same man. He had been standing firm on almost every significant point. After his illness, he conceded on nearly all of them. Clemenceau, who had publicly called Wilson pro-German just weeks earlier, walked away with a settlement that imposed crushing reparations on Germany, stripped it of territory, and required a formal declaration of war guilt. Whether a healthier Wilson would have held his ground, whether the Treaty of Versailles might have looked different enough to change what followed, is one of the great unanswerable questions of the 20th century. What historians broadly agree on is this: the settlement was so harsh, so punishing, so saturated with humiliation, that it became a direct cause of the revived German nationalism that rose in the decade that followed. The man who had spent the worst year of the pandemic refusing to speak publicly about it, who had presided over the suppression of those who tried to tell the truth, contracted the flu himself in secret at the most consequential moment of his presidency, and the flu may then have altered the trajectory of everything that came after. I'm not sure history has a word adequate to that kind of consequence. Irony seems too small. Tragedy seems closer. The silence of 1918 was not the product of evil men making evil decisions in dark rooms. It was the product of people who believed with varying degrees of sincerity that controlling information was a form of protection. That ordinary citizens could not be trusted with difficult truths. That managing perception was more important than enabling understanding. What the silence produced instead was a population that could not protect itself, communities that lost their trust in institutions at the exact moment when institutional trust was most desperately needed. And the people who paid the cost of that silence were not the officials who maintained it. They were the families, the workers who went to the parade, the children who stayed in school, the soldiers who boarded the ships who were never given the information they needed to make different choices. But even if they had been given that information, even if every newspaper had told the full truth, and the president had spoken and the public health authorities as perfectly honest, there remains a question I keep returning to. What could a doctor actually do when a patient arrived at the hospital door blue-lipped and drowning in the autumn of 1918? What did medicine actually have to offer in a world without antibiotics, without ventilators, without antiviral drugs, without even the knowledge of what a virus was? The answer to that question is far more sobering than you might expect, and the story of the people who worked in those wards, the doctors who knew they were losing and kept trying anyway, the nurses who showed up when the world was asking more from them than any person should be asked to give, is one of the most quietly devastating chapters of this entire pandemic. That is where we go next. Let me ask you something. If you walked into a hospital in 1918 burning with fever lungs, filling with fluid, turning the colour of a bruise, what would the doctor do for you? The honest answer, the one that the medical profession of 1918 was almost uniformly reluctant to say out loud, was not very much. They could give you aspirin. They could give you Vicks Vapo Rub. They could give you whiskey. They could give you hot soup, clean sheets, a cool cloth on your forehead, and someone to sit next to you through the night and count your breathing. If you were lucky, they might wrap you in what they called a flannel pneumonia jacket, a heavy garment meant to keep the chest warm, and set you near an open window because fresh air was considered therapeutic. Not because anyone had rigorously proven this, simply because it seemed reasonable and because the alternative was to do nothing at all. No antibiotics. The first one would not be discovered until 1928 and would not be widely available until after the Second World War. No mechanical ventilator. The iron lung would not be invented until 1928 as well, and was designed for a different condition entirely. No antiviral drugs. No understanding of what a virus even was. The scientific consensus of the era held that influenza was probably caused by a bacterium specifically, Haemophilus influenza, first identified in 1893. That turned out to be wrong. The bacterium was real. It just caused secondary infections, not the primary disease. The actual culprit, the H1N1 influenza A virus, would not be identified until 1931. In the autumn of 1918, the deadliest respiratory pandemic in modern history arrived in a world where medicine did not yet know what was causing it. This fact deserves to sit for a moment because I think it reframes everything about how doctors and nurses in 1918 should be understood. When we look back at this era, there is sometimes a temptation to judge the medical profession of 1918 by the standards of what we know now, to say how could they not have known? How could they have prescribed those things? How could they have been so limited? But the people in those hospital wards in 1918 were not unintelligent or uncaring. They were working in the conditions of their time with the knowledge of their time, and they were doing it with extraordinary dedication under pressure that was genuinely beyond anything the medical profession had previously faced. Dr. Henry Christian, the physician-in-chief at the Peter Bent Brigham Hospital in Boston, documented the situation his institution faced with remarkable honesty in his own records. By the autumn of 1918, more than half of the hospital's nursing and medical staff had themselves contracted influenza. They continued working anyway. Student nurses and young medical graduates, their training expedited, were called in to fill the gaps. Of the 557 influenza cases the Brigham treated between September and December of that year, 153 patients died. That is a mortality rate of roughly 27% among the patients sick enough to be hospitalized, meaning the ones who were already the most severely ill when they arrived. Dr. Christian noted something that in retrospect turns out to have been one of the most important clinical observations of the entire pandemic. The patients among his staff who were put to bed immediately at the first sign of illness and kept there recovered with one exception. Those in the general population who tried to push through their symptoms to continue working to stay on their feet, they were dying in dramatically higher numbers. Rest enforced and uncompromising was not just comfort care. It was in the absence of anything else the closest thing to a treatment that actually worked. The problem was that in 1918 rest was a luxury that most working families could not afford. You rested when you were dead, as the saying more or less went. You worked because if you did not work, your family did not eat. Now I want to tell you about aspirin because the aspirin story is one of those historical details that I find genuinely disturbing, and I mean that in the most educational sense of the word. In 1918, aspirin was a relatively new drug, having been synthesized and commercially introduced by the Bayer Company in 1899. By the time of the pandemic, it was already widely used and trusted. The problem was that nobody fully understood its pharmacology yet. Nobody fully understood the dosing. And the dosing that doctors were recommending in 1918 was by modern standards catastrophically high. The United States Surgeon General, the United States Navy, and the Journal of the American Medical Association all recommended aspirin for influenza patients in the weeks immediately before the October death spike, the worst month of the entire pandemic. The doses they recommended range from 8 grams to 31.2 grams per day. Today, the maximum safe daily dose of aspirin for an adult is considered to be approximately 4 grams. What happens when you take 8 to 30 grams of aspirin a day? Symptoms begin with ringing in the ears and sweating. Then come dehydration and rapid breathing. In severe overdose, fluid pours into the lungs, mimicking almost exactly the symptoms of severe influenza pneumonia. The fluid then enters the brain. It swells. Confusion follows, then coma, convulsions, and in severe cases, death. Karen Starko, a physician who studied this question in a paper published in 2009, argued that the aspirin overdose hypothesis helps explain some of the most puzzling features of the 1918 mortality pattern. In particular, why so many early deaths showed what she called extremely wet, sometimes hemorrhagic lungs in patients who had not yet developed the bacterial pneumonia that characterized later deaths. The lung flooding caused by salicylate toxicity is to a pathologist almost identical to the lung flooding caused by the cytokine storm of severe influenza. In other words, doctors in 1918 trying to help were in some cases giving their patients enough aspirin to produce symptoms that looked exactly like the disease they were trying to treat, and which in the most severe cases made the outcome significantly worse. Starko was careful to note that the evidence is circumstantial, and the debate continues. Death rates were similarly catastrophic in parts of the world where aspirin was less available. The flu itself was devastating enough without the aspirin. But the hypothesis sits there uncomfortable and unresolved that one of the most trusted interventions of the day may have contributed in some measure to the very deaths doctors were trying to prevent. I find this detail not as an indictment of the doctors of 1918, but as a reminder of something I think we forget in every era, including our own. There are things we are doing with confident intention that future generations will look back on and recognize as harmful. The problem is never malice. The problem is always the gap between what we know and what we do not yet know. Against this backdrop of limited medicine and enormous suffering, let me tell you about the nurses. By the autumn of 1918, the United States was facing a nursing crisis of a particular kind. Of the roughly 21,000 trained nurses the Army Nurse Corps had recruited for the war effort, more than half had already sailed for Europe by the time the pandemic's second wave hit the American home front. The civilian supply of trained nurses had been systematically depleted at exactly the moment it was most desperately needed. What happened next was one of the most remarkable episodes of civilian mobilization in American history, and one of the least remembered. In New York City, the nurse and social reformer Lillian Wald organized what became known as the Nurses Emergency Council, pulling together public health nurses, visiting nurses, and trained volunteers into a coordinated citywide response. Red Cross Motor Corps drivers, civilian women with automobiles were organized to carry nurses from house to house across the city so that nurses were not wasting their irreplaceable energy on transportation between patients. In the single month of October, New York City's nurses delivered 12,241 quarts of soup and more than 2,250 quarts of cereals, custards, and other liquid nourishments to sick families across the city. Think about what that means on the ground. A nurse arrives at a tenement apartment. Inside, the mother is ill and unable to stand. The father is already dead or dying in the bedroom. 3 children are sitting on the floor, crying and hungry. The nurse checks temperatures, changes linens, wraps the mother in a flannel pneumonia jacket, feeds the children, and then leaves, because there are 14 more apartments to visit before the day ends, and a Red Cross volunteer is waiting in a car downstairs. That nurse does this every day. Sometimes she herself is developing a fever by the end of the week. She keeps going. A Chicago visiting nurse supervisor documented that one of her nurses set out on a morning with 15 patients to visit and ended the day having seen nearly 50 because as she worked her way through a neighborhood, people appeared in doorways and windows and on the street, some of them too weak to stand, asking her to come inside. And then there are the stories from the edges of the country, in the places where the institutional response barely reached at all. Bessie B. Hawes was an African-American nurse working in Alabama during the pandemic. She recounted being asked by a health officer to travel 8 miles into the backwoods outside Talladega to tend to a family of 10 people who were all ill in bed and dying. No one else would go near them. Hawes agreed immediately. When she arrived at the small cabin, she found the mother already dead in the bed. The remaining 9 family members were in various stages of severe illness, some unconscious. She worked. She had almost nothing to work with. She worked. Hawes was one of a group of African-American nurses whose history during the 1918 pandemic has only been partially recovered by scholars. The official Red Cross had for years refused to accept black nurses into its nursing corps, citing the segregation policies of the era. When the pandemic overwhelmed the system entirely, this barrier cracked. 18 black nurses were ultimately accepted into the Army Nurse Corps in the final months of the pandemic, a number almost insultingly small, given the scale of what was happening, but historically significant for what it represented in the ongoing struggle for racial equality in American medicine. In Greenville, Mississippi, more than 1,800 African Americans died of influenza in the single month of October 1918. The local Red Cross set up an emergency hospital for black patients and put out a special call for black nurses because in a segregated society, black patients in many places could not receive care at the same facilities as white patients, regardless of how desperately they needed it. The pandemic was killing everyone. The infrastructure for dealing with that dying remained divided by race. Euphemia Davis, a black nurse from Montgomery, Alabama, worked for 4 consecutive weeks at the St. Bernard Mining Company Hospital during the epidemic without a day off. She did not describe this in her written account as heroism. She described it as what needed to be done. And then there is the story of Bessie Criner-Roper from Morganton, North Carolina, which I want to tell you because I think it represents in miniature something that happened thousands of times across the country in the autumn of 1918. Roper had graduated from nursing school around 1910. By 1918, she was a private duty nurse working in Asheville. When the flu arrived at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, she volunteered her free time at the university infirmary nursing sick students. Several of the students she cared for recovered. Bessie Roper died of influenza on October 22, 1918. Her obituary, which appeared in newspapers across the state, compared her sacrifice to those of soldiers dying on the battlefields of the Western Front. She was buried with military honors. Her lasting memorial for the remaining 5 years before it was established was a silver tea service presented by the Chapel Hill chapter of the Red Cross to the University Infirmary in her name. A silver tea service. For a woman who walked into a room full of a disease that was killing people in their prime and kept walking in, what strikes me when I spend time with these records is not the dramatic quality of the sacrifice. It is the ordinary quality of it. These were not mythological figures. They were people who had trained for a particular job, who found themselves in a situation far beyond what their training had prepared them for and who showed up anyway. Day after day, week after week, in many cases getting sick themselves, recovering or not recovering, and in either case being replaced as quickly as possible by someone else willing to do the same. The medical profession of 1918 was not equipped to cure this disease. It could not cure it. The tools did not exist. What it could do, what the nurses understood with a clarity that the doctors, sometimes caught up in the frustrating search for a treatment, occasionally lost sight of, was to keep people clean, fed warm, and accompanied. To stand between the sick and complete abandonment. To bear witness to a catastrophe they could not stop. In Peter Bent Brigham Hospital's records there is one line that I keep returning to. Doctor, Christian wrote that it seemed certain that failure to go to bed and remain there was an important cause of the high mortality throughout the country. He was talking about patients. But reading it now, I think about the nurses too, the ones who did not go to bed, who could not go to bed, who had 15 more patients to see before the day ended, and a family of 10 in the backwoods of Alabama who needed someone to walk through the door. They did not go to bed. They kept walking through doors. All of this, the aspirin, the flannel jackets, the nurses with their black bags of soup and thermometers, the doctors writing honest reports about mortality rates they could not change, was happening in wards and tenements and backwoods cabins across the country, while outside the hospital windows the dying was accumulating at a scale that nobody had seen in living memory. At some point cities ran out of coffins. At some point families ran out of people well enough to carry the dead. At some point the ordinary social rituals around death, the viewing, the wake, the funeral, the gathering of friends became impossible to conduct safely, and in some places were forbidden by law. What happened then to the bodies and to the living, who had to find a way to bury them, to grieve them, to count them, is perhaps the most difficult chapter of the entire 1918 story to sit with. That is where we are going next. Somewhere in a meadow outside Schuylkill Haven, Pennsylvania, a small town about 90 miles northwest of Philadelphia, there is a field that looks to the casual eye like nothing in particular. Flat grass, unremarkable soil, the kind of ground you would drive past without a second thought. In 2015, road construction workers widening a highway cut through the edge of that meadow. A heavy rain the night before had washed away the topsoil on the embankment. When the workers arrived in the morning, they saw bones, a tibia, a mandible identified by the tooth socket still intact, fragments of a skull plate. The county coroner was called. Research eventually confirmed what the evidence suggested. This was an unmarked mass grave from the autumn of 1918. The flu had arrived in the Schuylkill Haven area in October of that year. Approximately 17,000 residents in the surrounding region became ill. Close to 1,500 of them died. Casket makers could not keep up. Many of the victims, especially the poor, were buried without coffins, without headstones, without ceremony in the ground, in the dark and mostly in silence. The landowners, when they were asked about the bones, said something I find quietly devastating. "What is there?" Joan Bachman told reporters. "I think they should leave there, not to go back any farther. They've been there for 100 years. 100 years in the ground, unknown, unnamed, in a Pennsylvania meadow. And there are fields like that one all over the world." The historian Laura Spinney, in her book about the 1918 pandemic, wrote that there are very few cemeteries in the world that are older than a century, which do not contain a cluster of graves from the autumn of 1918. Walk into almost any old cemetery in almost any country, and somewhere among the headstones, if you look at the dates, you will find the pattern. Whole rows, whole families, dates in October, November, sometimes September, names with the same surname, 3 or 4 of them buried within days of each other. And yet Spinney also noted something that has always struck me as one of the most peculiar facts of this entire story. Despite the scale of what happened, there is no cenotaph. No major monument in London or Moscow or Washington. No dedicated museum. The First World War, which killed fewer people, has memorials in every country that fought it. The 1918 influenza, which killed many times more, is remembered personally quietly, and in many cases not at all. Why is that? I have thought about it quite a bit, and I think part of the answer has to do with exactly what this part of the story is about, with what happened to death itself in 1918. Because one of the most destabilizing things the pandemic did was not just kill people. It destroyed the rituals that the living used to process the fact that people die. Let me tell you what burying the dead normally looked like in 1918. Death in that era was far more present in daily life than it is today. People died at home. Bodies were laid out at home in the parlour for a period of viewing. Neighbours came. Family came. A priest or a minister came. There was a funeral, a procession, a burial. The community gathered physically around the grave of someone it had lost, and that gathering, with all its ritual weight and shared grief, was how people moved from the shock of loss toward something like continuation. These rituals existed for a reason. They are not decorative. They are how human beings metabolize grief. Remove them, and the grief does not disappear. It goes somewhere else. It goes underground, unprocessed, carried in the body for months or years, or in some cases for the rest of a person's life. In the autumn of 1918, all of those rituals were taken away almost simultaneously. Public funerals were banned in cities including Philadelphia and Chicago. Iowa prohibited public funerals outright. Wakes were prohibited. In some places, families were given 15 minutes, just 15 minutes for a funeral service. In other places, there was no service at all because there was no coffin, no undertaker, and no one well enough to dig a grave. And even in the cases where a family could technically hold a small private service, even then, the coffin might arrive days late because coffin manufacturers had run out of materials. The body might have been lying in the bedroom for 3 or 4 days before anyone could take it away. In some homes, the surviving family members were themselves too ill to move the body, and so they lay in the same room as the dead, too weak to do anything but wait. Now let me give you the numbers because I think the numbers matter here. In October 1918 alone, a single month, nearly 200,000 Americans died of influenza. To put that in context, the entire United States death toll in the First World War was approximately 53,000 killed in action over the entire course of American participation in the conflict from 1917 to 1918. In October of 1918, the flu killed nearly 4 times that number in 31 days. The supply chains simply could not absorb it. Coffin manufacturers were already stretched supplying military funerals from the war. When the pandemic hit, the shortfall became catastrophic. In Washington, the city ran out of coffins entirely around October 10th. When health officials called neighboring cities for help, the answer was the same everywhere. Baltimore had a coffin shortage. Philadelphia had a coffin shortage. The entire East Coast had a coffin shortage. In Philadelphia, the historian Alfred Crosby documented that at the peak of the crisis, one manufacturer stated he could sell 5,000 caskets in 2 hours if he had them. The city morgue at one point had 10 times as many bodies as coffins. The War Industries Board responded with an emergency order. Coffin makers were to immediately cease production of all fancy-trimmed couch and split-panel varieties. They were to manufacture only plain caskets standardized to 2 sizes. All unnecessary ornamentation was to stop. This was death rationalized for industrial production the way the war had rationalized everything else, and there was something grimly fitting about it. In Washington, a man named Fowler, who'd been given emergency authority over the city's burial operations, sent Marines from the Quantico base to serve as grave diggers. When that was not enough, he turned to inmates from Occoquan prison, people who could not refuse to work, because the living were running out. The District of Columbia's Commissioner Louis Brownlow took even more dramatic action. He intercepted 2 train cars carrying 270 coffins, bound for Pittsburgh, redirected them to the city hospital, and had them unloaded under armed guard. Armed guard over coffins. In the autumn of 1918, a trainload of empty boxes was worth guarding with soldiers, and yet even with all of that, the coffins were not enough. At Holy Cross Cemetery in Lansdowne, outside Philadelphia, seminarians, young men training for the priesthood, were turned into grave diggers. They were taking in an average of 200 bodies a day during October. They dug a long common trench and deposited coffins into it in rows. One of those seminarians, Reverend Thomas Brennan of St. Charles Borromeo Seminary, wrote down what he remembered. On one occasion, he recalled the students worked burying the dead until 10:30 at night by the light of the October full moon, the long rows of coffins in the trench presenting a picture he described as weird and impressive in the moonlight. I think about that image sometimes. Young men who had devoted their lives to the sacred reduced by necessity to digging in the dark by moonlight, filling a trench with the dead of their city. Not one body at a time, with ritual and ceremony and prayer for each soul. Row after row after row, as fast as they could work the full moon overhead, and the trench getting longer. There were people who tried to make money from all of this, and I want to note it because I think it is important not to idealize what happened. Undertakers in some cities raised their prices by as much as 600% during the crisis. Cemetery officials in some places charged a $15 burial fee and then made the bereaved families dig the graves themselves. Some funeral homes stacked caskets in their hallways, in their living quarters, anywhere they could fit them, and charged whatever they could get for each one. This is not particularly surprising if you think about it. It is what some people do under pressure. It does not define the era, but it sat alongside everything else. The dying, the shortage, the banned funerals, the bodies on porches, the bodies in beds, the children playing on mountains of stacked coffins in New Haven because they were 6 years old and did not understand what was inside them. In New Haven, a boy named John Delano, who was 6 years old in 1918, remembered climbing with his friends on caskets piled outside a mortuary. He and his friends thought it was wonderful, like climbing the pyramids, he said decades later when someone finally asked him about it. He was 6. He had no frame of reference for what it meant. He was just a child playing on the best climbing structure the neighbourhood had to offer that autumn. And then there was the question of where the grief went when there was nowhere to put it. Nancy Bristow, a historian at the University of Puget Sound who wrote a book about the pandemic's lost worlds, argued something I find genuinely important. The interruption of mourning rituals had consequences that extended long past 1918. When grief cannot be processed publicly, when communities cannot gather around a grave, when there is no ceremony to mark the passage from loss to continuation, the grief does not dissolve. It becomes private. It becomes something carried inside the individual body rather than shared with the surrounding community. Bristow said that grief from 1918 was carried around for decades without an opportunity to share it with those around them. That grief was private, individual, and in many cases largely unspeakable, partly because the pandemic itself was largely unspeakable. In the years that followed, suppressed by a culture that wanted to move on to celebrate the end of the war, to get back to something like normal. Have you ever known someone who suffered a loss they never fully mourned, who seemed to carry something they could not put down without ever being able to articulate what it was? There were millions of people like that in the 1920s. They had lost parents, children, siblings, spouses, sometimes several of them at once within the same week, and they had buried them quickly without ceremony, without gathering, and then been expected to continue. The dimensions of this grief globally are almost incomprehensible. Around 500 million people were infected, roughly 1/3 of the world's entire population at the time. Between 50 and 100 million people died. In India alone, the death toll has been estimated at between 12 and 17 million people. In some regions of sub-Saharan Africa, mortality ran as high as 5% of the total population. In Western Samoa, a Pacific Island territory, approximately 22% of the entire population died within 2 months. And in the Alaska native village of Brevig Mission, 72 out of 80 residents died over a period of 5 days in November 1918. 72 out of 80. 90% of a community gone in less than a week. The survivors, 8 people, were left in a village full of the dead in November in Alaska, without enough living hands to bury them. Decades later, in 1951, a Swedish-American pathologist named Johan Hultin travelled to Brevig Mission. He received permission from the village's survivors and descendants to exhume some of the mass grave. He recovered lung tissue from the permafrost-preserved bodies of the 1918 dead, brought it back to a laboratory, and attempted unsuccessfully to isolate the virus. He tried again in 1997 at the age of 72, after reading a paper by a young virologist named Jeffrey Taubenberger. This time, working with Taubenberger's team, they succeeded. The genetic sequence of the 1918 influenza virus, the blueprint of the thing that killed all those people, was reconstructed from the frozen tissue of the dead of Brevig Mission, preserved in the permafrost for 80 years. The dead of that Alaskan village, buried in a mass grave in the dark of a November that took almost everyone they knew, ultimately gave science something it needed to understand one of the greatest catastrophes in human history. I do not know what to do with that fact. I just know I cannot let it pass without saying it out loud. There is a custom in many cultures of placing markers on graves, headstones, crosses, flowers, photographs. The specific form varies almost infinitely across human civilization, but the underlying impulse is consistent. We mark the places where our dead lie so that we can find them again, so that we can return, so that we can say in whatever language the culture offers that this person existed and was here and mattered. In 1918, hundreds of thousands of people were buried without markers. in mass graves in fields in trenches dug by seminary students in the moonlight, or by prisoners from a local jail. Some of them have been found since, like the meadow in Pennsylvania, unearthed by a highway construction crew in 2015, and most of them have not. Go walk in an old cemetery. Look at the dates on the stones. Find the autumn of 1918. And if there are no stones for October and November of that year, if there is just a stretch of unmarked grass, a field that looks to the casual eye like nothing in particular, you will know what you're looking at. The pandemic ended eventually. Not with a vaccine, not with a treatment, not with a decisive public health intervention. It ended the way most pandemics end. The virus mutated toward less lethal forms, the surviving population built some immunity, and the wave finally broke. By 1919, the acute crisis was over. Cities reopened their schools and churches. Undertakers went back to their ordinary business. Coffin manufacturers returned to the fancy-trimmed varieties. The 15-minute funerals became full ceremonies again. The world breathed out. And then, with remarkable speed, a civilization that had just experienced one of the worst catastrophes in its history turned away from it almost entirely and tried very hard to forget. How a world forgets something that enormous, and what happens when it tries, that is where we are headed next. In 1924, a publishing house in London released what it considered a definitive record of the young century. The book was called These Eventful Years, the 20th Century in the Making as Told by Many of Its Makers. More than 80 contributors, professors, politicians, soldiers, scientists, produced a work of 1,300 pages. It was comprehensive. It was authoritative. It was the kind of volume that gets placed on library shelves and treated as a reference point for decades. It does not mention the 1918 influenza pandemic, not once. In 1,300 pages covering the defining events of the early 20th century, written just 5 years after a disease killed between 50 and 100 million people, the authors did not find space for a single paragraph about it. This is not an isolated oversight. History textbooks through much of the 20th century treated the 1918 influenza as a footnote, a minor aside in the larger story of the First World War. No monument was built to its dead in London. No monument in Washington. No monument in Moscow. The armistice of 1918, the sinking of the Titanic, the assassination of the Archduke, all of these have permanent memorials, museums, commemorations, film adaptations, school curricula. The deadliest pandemic in modern history has for most of the last 100 years had essentially none of those things. So the question I want to spend some time with is why? How does a civilization forget something that enormous? And I think this is the more interesting question. Did it actually forget, or did something more complicated happen? Let me start with the theory that most historians reach for first because it is partially right, even if it is not the whole story. The 1918 pandemic arrived in the middle of and immediately after the First World War, a conflict that was already consuming all available cultural space for grief, horror, and meaning-making. The war had a narrative. It had heroes. It had villains. It had a clear beginning, a middle and an end marked by the armistice on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918. Millions of men had gone to fight, had come home changed, or had not come home at all, and the culture had the structures, the medals, the parades, the monuments, the poetry, the novels, the veterans' organizations to process and contain that experience. The flu had none of that. James Wirch, a cognitive scientist who has studied collective memory, made the observation that collective memory depends on narratives with a clear beginning, middle, and end. The war provided exactly that kind of narrative arc. The flu, by contrast, arrived without warning, killed in a pattern nobody understood, and ended not with a victory but simply by becoming less lethal, over time drifting away like weather. There was no treaty, there was no armistice, there was no moment of triumph. There were just fewer deaths, and then fewer still, and then one day it was basically over, and nobody could quite say why. The historian Alfred Crosby, who wrote the first major modern account of the pandemic, titled his original book Epidemic, and pieced the conjunction of an epidemic and a peace as if the two things had happened simultaneously but separately. When he reissued the book in 1989, he renamed it America's Forgotten Pandemic, not because it had been forgotten by everyone, but because in the public collective sense, the sense in which a civilization chooses what it will remember and build monuments to it, had been allowed to vanish almost entirely. Here is the detail that I find most genuinely strange about the forgetting, the one that I keep returning to when I think about this story. The writers of the 1920s, the so-called lost generation, the group that produced some of the most significant literature in the English language, were almost all personally touched by the 1918 flu. Ernest Hemingway was in Italy. Gertrude Stein drove ambulances in France. Scott Fitzgerald was a soldier in training during the pandemic. John Dos Passos was there. These were people for whom the physical, sensory, traumatic reality of 1918 was not abstract history, but lived experience carried in their bodies, and yet almost none of them wrote about it directly. Crosby noted this with genuine puzzlement. He called it especially puzzling that among those Americans who let the pandemic slip from their work were members of a group of supposedly hypersensitive young people who created some of the greatest masterpieces of American literature, people for whom the First World War was the central experience of their lives, and who wrote about that war with unflinching, exhausting honesty. They wrote about the trenches. They wrote about shell shock. They wrote about the waste and the lies and the disillusionment. But the flu, which had killed far more people than the war, appears in their work only in traces, fragments, shadows. Why, one explanation is that the flu did not lend itself to the literary values of the era. The most celebrated writing of the 1920s and 30s was shaped by a particular aesthetic, the value of precision, of understatement, of the concrete sensory detail that implies vast emotional truth without stating it. Hemingway's iceberg theory. The clean, declarative sentence that carries the weight of the unsaid. That aesthetic worked brilliantly for the war, which produced images of almost classical clarity: the trench, the wire, the poppy field, the mud, the dead. But the flu killed in bedrooms. Its images were fever and delirium and laboured breathing and the sudden stillness of a body that had been alive an hour ago. There was nothing to aim at, nothing to describe with satisfying precision, nothing that translated easily into the narrative grammar of that literary moment. Virginia Woolf noticed this herself. In her essay on being ill, published in 1926, she wrote that novels one would have thought would have been devoted to influenza, and yet they were not. Literature, she observed, had a strong tendency to ignore the visceral reality of the body, to treat illness as an interruption in the life of the mind rather than as an experience with its own profound interiority. But here is what the scholar Elizabeth Utker argued in her book Viral Modernism, a work I find genuinely illuminating, and it reframes the entire question. The 1918 flu was not absent from the literature that followed it. It went underground. It found its way into the texture and the atmosphere and the emotional climate of works that never mention it by name. It was not forgotten. It was transformed. Take Woolf's own novel, Mrs. Dalloway, published in 1925. Clarissa Dalloway moves through a London day giving a party remembering her past. The novel is always read as a meditation on the aftermath of the First World War, and it is that without question. But Outker points out that Clarissa Dalloway has also had influenza. The novel tells us she's grown white since her illness. Her doctors have told her that the flu has damaged her heart. As she moves through the streets of London, her heartbeat and its irregularities pulse through her consciousness, shaping how she perceives everything. The sights and sounds and smells of the sick room float back through her memory. Woolf herself had influenza multiple times between 1916 and the mid-1920s, including during the pandemic years. Her heart was likely damaged by the illness. She wrote extensively in her diaries about being cut off from her work. From her pen, she described being divorced from her pen as one of the most painful aspects of serious illness, as if the illness had separated her from herself. And then she wrote the most celebrated novel of the decade, in which the central consciousness moves through London, carrying invisibly to almost everyone around her the long shadow of having been very sick and never quite fully recovered. The poet William Butler Yeats wrote The Second Coming in 1919. In the weeks before he wrote it, his wife George, who was pregnant, caught the flu and came very close to death. Yeats sat at her bedside watching. When she recovered, he sat down and wrote a poem about the centre, not holding, and the worst being full of passionate intensity about a rough beast slowly making its way toward Bethlehem to be born. We read that poem as a response to the First World War, to the Russian Revolution, to the political violence in Ireland, and it is all of those things. But Yeats had just watched a pandemic nearly take his wife and unborn child, at a moment when the entire world was simultaneously watching the same thing happen to people they loved. The poem that emerged from that experience describes a world coming apart at a level deeper than politics or war, a world in which the very foundations of order and meaning are no longer reliable. The flu is not in the second coming, but the flu is in the second coming. Then there is T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land, published in 1922, universally considered one of the defining works of 20th century literature, and almost universally discussed as a response to the First World War and the spiritual desolation of modern civilization. Eliot himself was ill in 1918 and 1919. His wife Vivian was chronically ill. The poem's opening lines, describing April as the cruelest month breeding memory and desire out of dead land, have been read as a metaphor for the disillusionment of the post-war generation. But Outker argues that the poem also carries the texture and the emotional landscape of the pandemic, the breakdown of bodies, the fear of contagion, the sense of a civilization drowning in its own dead. When Eliot writes of a crowd flowing over London Bridge and asks how many those are whom death had undone, he's drawing on the imagery of Dante's Hell. He's also writing in a city that had 3 or 4 years earlier been full of people wearing masks, full of horse-drawn wagons, collecting bodies from doorsteps, full of the particular horror of a death that came from nowhere and left no time to prepare. The war and the flu were not two separate experiences. They were a single overwhelming catastrophe that arrived in the same years and was processed by the literature of the era as a single overwhelming catastrophe, with the flu's contribution mostly unnamed, mostly invisible, mostly absorbed into the larger narrative of the war's devastation. And yet, and I want to make sure I say this clearly because it matters, not everyone forgot. The 105-year-old woman that scholar Elizabeth Outker interviewed while researching her book had the flu in Richmond when she was 8 years old. When Outker asked in her own words rather cheerfully why she thought people forgot the flu, the woman looked at her as if she had said something nonsensical. "We didn't forget," she said. "We didn't ignore it. We didn't forget." And she said this with a clarity Outker noted that conveyed something important. The idea that the flu was forgotten is a public story, a collective story, a cultural story. It is not the personal story of the people who lived through it. Reading letters from survivors over and over again, you find that phrase, "I never forgot. I never forgot. I never forgot." What was forgotten, or perhaps more accurately suppressed, was not the experience itself, but the public language for it. The monuments, the commemorations, the national narratives that allow private experience to become shared history. Those did not come into being, not for a very long time, and without them the grief and the memory remained exactly where Nancy Bristow said it did. Private individual carried in bodies spoken of only in families, only in quiet moments, only in the way you check on someone you love when they get a fever, understanding in your bones exactly why that moment demands such attention. Which brings me to the Roaring Twenties, because I think the relationship between the pandemic and the decade that followed it is one of the most under-examined stories in 20th century history. In the 1920s, something extraordinary happened to the culture of the industrialized world. The Jazz Age, the Flapper, the Charleston, the cocktail party, the explosion of nightclubs and dance halls and cabarets, the unprecedented public mixing of social classes and races in shared cultural spaces, the dramatic shift in women's dress hair and social behaviour, the sense which permeates the literature and music and art of the decade of a civilization, deliberately, almost aggressively, choosing pleasure over solemnity, noise over silence, movement over stillness. The conventional narrative attributes all of this to the aftermath of the First World War, the death of the old social order, the liberation from Victorian constraints, the young people who had survived the trenches returning home, determined to live before they died again. And that narrative is correct as far as it goes. But consider what else those same young people had survived. They had survived a pandemic that killed healthy 25-year-olds in 48 hours. They had been told to stay home, wear masks, avoid crowds, not gather, not sing, not dance, not touch each other. They had watched their friends and siblings and parents lie in beds turning blue. They had buried the dead quickly without ceremony and been told not to gather even for that. And then when the pandemic ended, when the restrictions lifted, when the world said it was safe again to gather, what do you suppose those young people wanted to do? They wanted to dance. Specifically and urgently and loudly and with as many other people as possible. They wanted to be in crowded rooms with music playing and someone pressed against them, and a glass in their hand, and the feeling physical and immediate that they were alive and the dead were not, and that being alive was something to be expressed rather than contained. I am not saying the Roaring Twenties were caused by the 1918 flu. History is too complicated for single-cause explanations, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. But I am saying that you cannot fully understand the cultural explosion of the 1920s without accounting for the psychological aftermath of 2 years in which the entire world was reminded suddenly and without mercy that young bodies die too. There is a phenomenon that psychologists call post-traumatic growth. The observation that some people following severe trauma do not simply recover, but emerge with a changed relationship to life that includes a heightened appreciation for the present moment, a sharper attention to what actually matters, a reduced tolerance for the slow erosion of living cautiously and joylessly. I want to be careful not to romanticize the 1920s, which contained alongside all its glittering energy plenty of serious ugliness, the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, the criminalization of alcohol and the organized crime that followed it, the economic inequality that would eventually tear the whole decade apart. The Jazz Age was not a paradise. It was a human decade with all the complications that implies. But when I look at the photographs from the 1920s, the packed dance floors, the new fashions, the young women with their short hair and their cigarettes and their frank expressions, I see something that the flu helped create. A generation that had been told to stay inside, to stay separate, to stay quiet, and had obeyed and had lost people while obeying, and had emerged from the whole experience with a very clear understanding of how quickly things end. They chose when the choice was given back to them to make some noise. In 1939, 21 years after the pandemic, a writer named Catherine Ann Porter finally published a novella about what it had felt like to almost die of influenza in October of 1918. The book was called Pale Horse, Pale Rider. Porter had been a 28-year-old reporter in Denver when she fell ill. Her fever was so severe that her hair turned white and fell out. The newspaper she worked for set her obituary in type. Her family made funeral arrangements. The young army lieutenant she'd been spending time with contracted the flu and died. She survived but wrote later that the illness had simply divided her life, and after it she was in some strange way altered. It took her 21 years to write it down. And even then it was considered a marginal literary work, a small strange novella about a pandemic that most people had already managed to put behind them. The title comes from an old spiritual which in turn comes from the Book of Revelation. The pale rider on the pale horse, the one whose name is death and whose companion is hell. But in Porter's novella, Miranda, the young reporter, who is clearly Porter herself, survives. The pale rider passes over her and takes someone else. She recovers and walks out of the hospital into a world from which the war is finally over, the armistice declared, everyone celebrating. And she feels Porter writes nothing, only the most appalling and humiliating indifference. That indifference, that numbness at the moment when celebration is required, I think that is the most honest thing anyone wrote about the psychological experience of surviving the 1918 pandemic. You came out the other side and the world expected you to be glad, and you were glad in some technical sense to still be breathing, but between you and the world's gladness there was a distance you could not quite account for, a membrane through which you could see and hear the celebration, but could not fully feel it. That distance was the pandemic. It never fully closed for many people. They just learned to live with it, to go about their lives with something unnamed and unacknowledged sitting at the edge of their field of vision, colouring the way everything looked, shaping the questions they asked in the dark before they went to sleep. How a civilization chooses what to remember and what to quietly let go, that is, I have come to think, one of the most consequential decisions any culture makes. Because what gets forgotten does not simply disappear. It goes somewhere else. It gets expressed in other forms, in other language, in decades of behaviour that nobody can quite explain by the visible causes alone. The 1918 pandemic did not disappear because the 1920s forgot it. It showed up at every crowded dance hall. It showed up in every poem about a civilization falling apart at the centre. It showed up in every family that checked a child's temperature with slightly more anxiety than the situation seemed to call for without quite being able to say why. It showed up, as we will see, in the science that was transformed by the experience of watching something so devastating and being so unable to stop it. What happened to the science of infectious disease after 1918? The research, the vaccines, the slow accumulation of knowledge that would define the 20th century's relationship to viruses, that story begins right here in the aftermath of everything we have just described. Picture this, it is 1918. The world is in the middle of the deadliest infectious disease outbreak in modern history, and the scientists trying to stop it do not know what is causing it, not approximately, not vaguely. They genuinely, completely and unanimously believe the wrong thing. In 1892, a German bacteriologist named Richard Pfeiffer had isolated a small rod-shaped organism from the nasal passages of influenza patients and announced with considerable authority that he had found the culprit. He called it Bacillus influenzae Pfeiffer's bacillus, as the scientific world came to know it. The discovery was celebrated. Pfeiffer was working under Robert Koch, whose germ theory framework had already cracked tuberculosis, cholera, and anthrax. The scientific establishment was deeply inclined to believe him. So in 1918, when the pandemic arrived and researchers around the world rushed to their laboratories to find Pfeiffer's bacillus in dying patients and develop vaccines against it. They were doing something that looked exactly like science. They were isolating the organism, testing it, producing antisera, distributing vaccines. The American Army Medical School tested 2 million doses of bacterial vaccine in 1918. Every single one of those vaccines was targeting the wrong thing, not because the scientists were incompetent, because the virus that was actually causing the disease was invisible to the instruments they had. In 1918, no one had yet proven that human diseases could be caused by viruses, entities so small they passed through the finest available laboratory filters, too small to be seen under any existing microscope, too small to be grown in any existing culture medium. The concept existed theoretically, but applying it to influenza convincingly had not yet been done. In the most literal possible sense, the scientists of 1918 were fighting in the dark. What happened next? The 20-year scientific detective story that finally answered the question is one of the most important stories in the history of medicine, and one that almost nobody knows. The first clue came during the pandemic itself, and it came from researchers who noticed something strange. A small team at the Rockefeller Institute, Peter Olitsky and Frederick Gates, took nasal secretions from patients sick with influenza in 1918 and 1921 and passed them through Birkefeld filters, ultra-fine ceramic filters designed to be too small for bacteria to pass through. The infectious agent, whatever it was, went right through the filter. Bacteria cannot do that. Something else was causing this disease. Their findings should have been the breakthrough. Instead, it was dismissed. Oswald Avery, a meticulous and brilliant researcher also at the Rockefeller, showed that if you improved the culture conditions for Pfeiffer's bacillus, you could find it consistently in influenza patients. The viral hypothesis was set aside. Olitsky and Gates were not vindicated for another decade. Then came the pig farmers. In the autumn of 1918, simultaneous with the human pandemic, farmers in the American Midwest began noticing that their hogs were sick. The animals presented with exactly the same symptoms as humans: high fever, respiratory distress, rapid deterioration. A veterinarian in Iowa named J.S. Cohen wrote at the time that he considered it a very similar, if not identical, condition to the human pandemic, and named it swine influenza. His contemporaries noted the parallel with interest, and then mostly moved on, preoccupied with the human crisis. The hog flu, unlike the human pandemic, did not disappear. It settled into the American pig population and reappeared every autumn year after year. By the late 1920s, it had become a familiar feature of Midwestern agricultural life, a seasonal nuisance that pig farmers dealt with the way they dealt with other seasonal nuisances. This is where a 29-year-old virologist at the Rockefeller Institute named Richard Shope enters the story. Shope had grown up in Iowa. He knew about swine influenza from first-hand experience in the way that children who grow up on farms know things that researchers in city laboratories do not. In the late 1920s, working with his mentor Paul Lewis, he began investigating the pig disease systematically. He did exactly what Olitsky and Gates had done with humans. A decade earlier, he took mucus and lung samples from infected pigs and filtered them. The filtrate, the material that passed through the bacteria-proof filter, caused influenza-like disease when introduced to healthy pigs. But here was the crucial detail: the filtrate alone caused a mild disease. When you mixed the filtrate with Pfeiffer's bacillus, the familiar old bacterium, you got the severe disease. The bacterium was not the cause of influenza. It was a secondary opportunist making a viral infection worse, which is why it had been consistently found in the sickest patients throughout the 1918 pandemic. In 1931, Shope published his findings. He had isolated the first influenza virus from swine. 2 years later, in 1933, a team at the British Medical Research Council's Mill Hill Laboratory Wilson Smith, Christopher Andrews and Patrick Laidlaw did what Shop had done with pigs, but with humans. They passed filtered secretions from influenza patients through a Birkefeld filter and introduced the filtrate to ferrets. The ferrets became ill with what was clearly influenza. They had isolated the human influenza A virus, the first time this had ever been accomplished. 13 years after the pandemic, science finally knew what it had been fighting. Now here is the part of the story that I find almost unbearably ironic in the way that history sometimes produces moments of pure, exquisite irony. Paul Lewis, the mentor who had worked with Shop at the Rockefeller, the man who had been Shop's guide and collaborator in the early pig experiments, did not live to see the discovery confirmed. He'd gone to Brazil in the early 1930s to study a yellow fever outbreak. Young Shop had volunteered for the trip, but Lewis refused to take him, perhaps to protect him, or perhaps simply because one of them needed to stay back and continue the influenza work. Lewis contracted yellow fever in his laboratory. He died of it in 1929. Shop had been refused the trip that killed his mentor. He continued working on influenza alone, and it was Shop in 1935 and 1936 who made the final connection. He drew blood from older Americans, people who had been alive in 1918, and tested whether they had antibodies capable of neutralizing the swine flu virus. They did. People who'd survived the 1918 pandemic carried in their blood the immunological memory of the virus that had nearly killed them, and that memory recognized the pig virus as essentially the same thing. The disease that had swept the world in 1918, leaving 50 million dead, had simultaneously jumped to pigs. The human strain evolved in humans. The pig strain persisted in pigs. But they shared a common ancestor, what one scientist later called, without irony, the mother of all pandemics, and the blood of the survivors carried the proof. This convergence of discoveries in the 1930s did something to the scientific world that the pandemic itself had been unable to do while it was happening. It created urgency. Not the frantic, overwhelmed urgency of 1918, the kind that produces desperate improvisation and brave ignorance in equal measure, but the focused institutional urgency of a generation of young scientists who had grown up knowing exactly what was at stake. Here is what the science accomplished in roughly 15 years between the identification of the virus in 1933 and the end of the Second World War. In 1935, researchers discovered that the influenza virus could be grown on the membrane of a fertilized hen's egg. This sounds like a footnote, but it was a transformation. For the first time, scientists could produce the influenza virus in quantity outside a living animal in a controlled setting. This single technical discovery made vaccine research tractable. In 1940, a researcher named Thomas Francis became the first person to isolate the influenza B virus, demonstrating that there was not one strain of the flu, but a family of related viruses, each requiring its own approach. And then the Second World War gave the research its ultimate pressure. The military remembered 1918 with absolute clarity. About 1 in every 67 American soldiers had died of influenza. During the First War, more Americans died of the flu during the First World War than were killed in battle. The army was not going to let that happen again. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, Thomas Francis, by then heading a new department of epidemic disease prevention at the University of Michigan, was appointed executive director of the Army's Commission on Influenza. His mission: develop, test, manufacture, and administer a vaccine capable of preventing a recurrence of the 1918 pandemic. He called a 27-year-old researcher to join him. The young man's name was Jonas Salk. Let me pause here for a moment because I want to make sure the weight of this connection lands properly. Jonas Salk is remembered today primarily as the man who developed the polio vaccine in the 1950s, one of the most celebrated medical achievements of the 20th century. A moment so significant that when the clinical trial results were announced at a press conference in Ann Arbor in April of 1955, church bells rang in cities across America, and grown men and women wept in the streets. Salk became essentially overnight one of the most famous scientists in the world. What is less well remembered is that Salk's entire scientific formation, his training in vaccine methodology, his understanding of how to work with killed viruses, his approach to building and testing immune responses came from his years working with Thomas Francis on the influenza vaccine. The polio vaccine was built on the foundation of the flu vaccine. The flu vaccine was built on the foundation of everything the 1918 pandemic had revealed through its catastrophic failure about what medicine needed to understand. In 1942, Francis and Salk conducted their first large field trials. 8,000 patients at 2 Michigan hospitals were vaccinated, with some subsequently exposed to the flu, deliberately an approach considered ethically acceptable at the time, though we would view it differently now. In patients who had received the vaccine, flu antibodies increased by 85%. A year later, 12,500 members of an army training program at 8 universities received injections. The stakes were extraordinarily high. Flu cases had already begun spreading across the country, and the army was watching every data point. The vaccine worked. In 1945, the first inactivated influenza vaccine was approved for military use in the United States. In 1946, it was approved for civilian use. For the first time in history, there existed a tool specifically designed to prevent the disease that had killed 50 million people in 1918. It had taken 27 years from the pandemic to the vaccine. 27 years of pig farms and ferrets and fertilized hen eggs, and a young man from Iowa who remembered how the hogs had gotten sick in the autumn. His neighbors were dying. The story does not end there, because this is the point where the science ran into a problem that it still has not fully solved. A problem that is, I think, one of the most fascinating in all of biology. Influenza mutates. Not slowly the way most viruses mutate, but rapidly and continuously season after season. The surface proteins that the immune system learns to recognize and that vaccines are designed to target change constantly. This means that immunity to last year's flu strain provides incomplete protection against this year's flu strain, and it means that a vaccine effective against the circulating strains of one year may be significantly less effective the following year if the virus has drifted. Thomas Francis was the first person to document this phenomenon in a rigorous scientific way. In 1947, he noticed that the existing vaccine was not performing as expected against the strains then circulating. He and his team were the first to understand what was happening. The virus had changed. This discovery, which became known as antigenic drift, transformed the entire framework of influenza vaccination and led eventually to the system we still use today, where a new flu vaccine is formulated every year based on predictions about which strains will be dominant in the coming season. The World Health Organization created its first global influenza surveillance network in 1952, a system designed specifically to track the movement and mutation of influenza viruses across the planet, so that the annual vaccine composition could be adjusted to match. That network was a direct institutional legacy of the 1918 pandemic. Think about what that means. Every year, laboratories in a global network of countries analyze circulating flu strains. Every year, a committee of scientists meets and makes their best prediction about which strains will be dominant in the coming season. Every year, vaccine manufacturers produce hundreds of millions of doses based on that prediction. Every year, hundreds of millions of people roll up their sleeves. This entire global infrastructure, the surveillance network, the annual prediction process, the manufacturing pipeline, the public health recommendations exists because in 1918, a pandemic killed 50 million people, and the scientific world had no idea what was causing it and no vaccine to offer. There is a line from a 1972 textbook on influenza that I keep returning to. The authors, two Dutch researchers named Mulder and Hers, wrote in their preface, "We regret very much the fact that an influenza virologist is unable to live, say, 200 years so that he himself would be able to see what has developed from his earlier assumptions." They were writing about the puzzle of influenza, about the frustration of a disease that refuses to be fully understood, about the way each generation of scientists inherits both the insights and the unsolved questions of the one before. But I think those words apply to something larger than virology. The scientists who worked through the 1920s and 1930s to understand what had caused the 1918 pandemic, Shop with his pigs, Smith and Andrews and Laidlaw with their ferrets, Francis with his killed virus vaccine, Salk with his borrowed methodology, none of them could have seen where their work was going. Shop could not have known his pig experiments would lead through a chain of scientific inheritance to a young man at the University of Pittsburgh who would announce the defeat of polio. Francis could not have known that the rigorous vaccine trial methodology he developed for influenza would become the gold standard for testing every major vaccine that followed. They were scientists working in the 1930s and 40s with the tools of the 1930s and 40s, doing the best work those tools allowed, trying to answer the questions that the dead of 1918 had made unavoidable. But they planted things, and the things they planted are still growing. In 2005, a team of researchers led by Jeffrey Taubenberger at the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology completed the sequencing of the entire genome of the 1918 H1N1 virus. The genetic sequence, all 8 genes, had been painstakingly reconstructed from fragments preserved in formalin-fixed autopsy tissue from lung samples preserved in the permafrost of Alaska, from tiny pieces of biological material that had been sitting in storage jars and freezers for 8 decades. With that complete sequence, scientists were able to reconstruct a live version of the 1918 virus in a high-security laboratory, setting something that would have seemed like science fiction to the researchers of 1918 who did not even know what category of organism they were fighting. They found, among other things, that a related descendant of the 1918 H1N1 strain is still circulating today. Every human influenza, an infection on the planet for more than a century, traces its lineage back to the pandemic. The virus that emerged in 1918 has never really left. It has evolved, recombined, drifted and shifted into new forms, but its genetic fingerprints remain in every influenza, a strain that circulates today. In a very specific biological sense, the 1918 pandemic is not history. It is still ongoing in attenuated form in the lungs of the people who get the flu this winter. All of that science, the surveillance networks and annual vaccines and genomic sequencing and global health infrastructure, represents what a civilization does when it decides to learn from catastrophe rather than simply endure it. It is in that sense a hopeful story, or at least a story about human capacity. The science that 1918 forced into existence has saved hundreds of millions of lives since 1945. Every flu season that does not become a pandemic is in part a product of the work that began in the pig farms of Iowa in 1918 and continued generation by generation right up to the present. But there is one more thing that 1918 revealed, something that science, for all its progress, has still not fully answered. Something about the specific nature of this disease, the specific people it targeted, the specific reason it was so much more lethal in young adults than in anyone else. The mystery at the biological heart of the 1918 pandemic, which researchers are still trying to understand today. That is the thread we follow next. We left off last time with something I want to hold on to for just a moment before we dive back in, At the very end of part 11, I told you that 1918 revealed a mystery that science, for all the astonishing progress it has made in the century since, has still not fully answered. The surveillance networks, the annual vaccines, the genomic sequencing, the global health infrastructure, all of that was built from the catastrophe. All of that is real and hard-won and has saved hundreds of millions of lives. And yet, there is something at the biological heart of the 1918 pandemic that researchers are still arguing about in the literature today. Something about who it killed. Something about why it killed the people it killed. Something that makes this particular pandemic different from every other pandemic in the historical record. And that difference, if we could truly understand it, might be the most important thing a future generation of scientists will ever learn. That is where we are going tonight. Let us start with what we know for certain, because it is worth stating clearly before we venture into the uncertain. We know that the 1918 pandemic killed somewhere between 50 and 100 million people worldwide. The range is so wide because counting was imprecise, because records were incomplete, because in many parts of the world, India, sub-Saharan Africa, indigenous communities in Alaska and the Pacific, the deaths were never properly tallied. Some modern researchers have pushed the estimate to as high as 100 million. Others feel 50 to 80 million is more defensible. Nobody disputes that it was the most lethal infectious disease event in the history of the modern world. We know that it killed in 3 waves. The spring wave of 1918 was relatively mild. The autumn wave, which crested in October and November of 1918, was catastrophic. A third wave followed in the winter and spring of 1919, less deadly than the second, but still far worse than normal seasonal flu. The pandemic officially ended in the spring of 1920, though the virus never truly went away. As we discussed last time, a descendant of the 1918 H1N1 strain circulates in some form to this day. We know it moved at the speed of war, it travelled on troop ships, it walked through crowded military camps, it rode the railways and the trade routes reaching every corner of the inhabited world within months. And we know this is the thing that has always set 1918 apart, that it killed young adults. Specifically, disproportionately, almost incomprehensibly. That is the mystery. In every other flu pandemic we have on record, the mortality curve looks like what epidemiologists call a U-shape high death rates, among the very young, high death rates among the very old, and relatively low death rates among the healthy adults in the middle. This makes biological sense. The very young have immune systems that are still developing. The very old have immune systems that have grown tired with age. The adults in the middle, 20, 30, 40 years old, have robust immunity built up over years of exposure to various pathogens. They fight back hard. They survive. The 1918 pandemic produced something different, something that when you graph the mortality data creates a shape that researchers call a W-curve high death rates, among the very young, high death rates among the very old, and a sharp spike of death right in the middle in people between about 20 and 40 years old. The peak of that middle spike in many of the historical data sets falls right around age 27 years old, peak mortality in a flu pandemic. That is not how flu is supposed to work. When researchers first saw this pattern clearly, when they mapped it across multiple cities, multiple countries, multiple data sets, they were genuinely baffled. Not just puzzled in the academic sense, but baffled in the kind of way that keeps scientists up at night and reshapes entire research programs, because this pattern had never been seen before and has not been seen since. Not in the 1957 pandemic, not in 1968, not in 2009. Only in 1918, why? The first serious hypothesis was proposed decades after the pandemic, and it has a name that sounds dry but contains within it a striking idea, original antigenic sin. Here is how it works. When your immune system encounters an influenza virus for the first time, the very first time in early childhood, it mounts a response. It produces antibodies targeted at the specific surface proteins of that specific viral strain. And the memory of that first encounter is etched into your immune system in a very particular way, not just as a stored antibody, but as a kind of template, a preference, a bias. The next time you encounter influenza, even a different strain, your immune system doesn't start fresh. It reaches back to that original template first. It produces antibodies based on that first memory, tries to apply them to the new virus, and then if those antibodies don't quite fit, tries to adapt. The immune system is not infinitely flexible in this early stage. It is shaped in ways that last a lifetime by that first encounter. The term original antigenic sin was coined by Thomas Francis, the same Thomas Francis who developed the first influenza vaccine with Jonas Salk in a 1960 paper. The word sin here is being used in the theological sense of something inherited and carried forward, not something chosen. The original encounter shapes everything that follows. Now apply this to 1918. If you were 65 years old in 1918, you'd been born around 1853. Your first encounter with influenza, your original antigenic template, was set in childhood, perhaps in the 1850s, 1860s, some era before 1889. The strains circulating in those decades were different from what was circulating in 1918, but there may have been some overlap, some partial match. Your old immune memory could contribute something even imperfectly to the fight. If you were 27 years old in 1918, you had been born around 1891. Your first encounter with influenza was set in childhood, or early adolescence, which means it was likely set somewhere around 1895 to 1905. That era was dominated by a particular family of influenza strains, and those strains, it turns out, share very little with the H1N1 virus of 1918. Your original antigenic template, the tool your immune system reaches for first, was essentially useless against this particular virus. And here is the grim twist: a useless template is not simply neutral, it may actually be harmful. Let me explain what happens inside a body fighting a virus it has never encountered before, one for which its immune memory is poorly matched. The immune system does not simply shrug and start over, it escalates. It throws everything it has at the threat. T cells and B cells proliferate. Cytokines, the chemical messengers that coordinate the immune response, flood the tissue. Inflammation surges in the lungs where the virus is replicating fastest. The body is trying to create in real time the defense it should have had in advance. In 1918, pathologists performing autopsies on young victims found lungs that were not simply infected, they were destroyed. The tissue had been ravaged not just by the virus, but by the immune response to the virus. The lungs were full of fluid, hemorrhaged, consolidated. Soldiers who had been perfectly healthy at breakfast were dead by nightfall, their lungs having essentially drowned themselves in the immune system's frantic attempt to fight back. The term researchers now use for this process, when an immune response becomes so intense that it damages the very tissue it is trying to protect, is a cytokine storm. The storm metaphor is apt. It is not that the immune system fails. It is that it succeeds so completely, so furiously, so without restraint that the damage it does in the process of fighting is worse than what the virus alone would have caused. And the people most likely to generate the most ferocious cytokine storm, the people in the prime of immune vigor, the people with the most robust, most activated, most aggressive immune systems, the 27-year-olds, the strongest bodies fought the hardest, and in fighting the hardest they sometimes destroyed themselves. This is the hypothesis that has dominated the scientific literature for decades, and there is real evidence to support it. Researchers studying the 1918 pandemic in the 1990s and 2000s found elevated levels of cytokine activity in reconstructed models of the disease. Studies of pandemic flu survivors who were still alive in the 1980s showed that older adults, people who'd been young in 1890 or 1895, carried antibodies that partially cross-reacted with the 1918 strain in ways that younger survivors did not. But there is a problem. The hypothesis, while elegant and supported by significant evidence, does not fully explain everything. The cytokine storm theory accounts for some of the excess mortality in young adults, but the magnitude of the W curve, the sheer scale of deaths in the 20 to 40 age bracket, remains larger than cytokine storm alone can explain. There are variations in the pandemic's mortality pattern from city to city, from country to country, from military camp to military camp, that the single hypothesis model does not capture cleanly. The 1918 virus was not just deadly in a single uniform way. It was deadly in different ways in different populations, and the reasons for those variations are still being debated. There is also the question of bacterial co-infection. We touched on this in an earlier part of the series, the role of Pfeiffer's bacillus and its successors in making viral influenza so much more deadly. In 1918, there were no antibiotics. Bacterial pneumonia, which could follow in the wake of influenza and finish what the virus had begun, was essentially untreatable. How much of the total mortality was caused by the virus directly, and how much was caused by the secondary bacterial infections that the virus enabled? The research is ongoing, and the answers affect how we understand the W curve. Some researchers have argued that if you control for bacterial pneumonia deaths, the W curve flattens somewhat, that some of the excess young adult mortality was not purely cytokine storm deaths, but bacterially mediated deaths that happened to fall disproportionately on young adults, perhaps because young adults were more likely to be in the military camps and trenches where bacterial infection spread most easily. Others disagree. The debate continues. And then there is the question that of all the unresolved questions about 1918, I find the most quietly unsettling. Why did this particular virus, the H1N1 strain that emerged in 1918, have the specific properties it had? Why was it so much more lethal than the seasonal influenza strains that preceded it, and so much more lethal than the pandemic strains that followed it in 1957 and 1968? The 1957 pandemic, H2N2, known as the Asian flu, killed between 1 and 4 million people worldwide. A terrible toll. But those deaths followed the expected pattern, the very young and the very old, with a normal U-curve. 1968, H3N2. The Hong Kong flu killed roughly 1 million. Also, U-curve mortality. 2009 H1N1, again a descendant carrying some genetic echoes of 1918, killed between 150,000 and 500,000, mostly in younger adults interestingly, which some researchers attributed to a partial antigenic memory effect similar to what occurred in 1918. But the scale of lethality was incomparably smaller. The 1918 virus was different in every direction that matters, more lethal, more specifically targeted at the young and healthy, more explosive in its progression from symptom to death, in many documented cases less than 24 hours from first symptoms to fatal respiratory collapse. Jeffrey Taubenberger's team, working with the reconstructed genome in the 2000s, found features of the 1918 virus that were unusual particular configurations of the hemagglutinin and neuraminidase proteins on the virus's surface, particular characteristics of the polymerase genes that govern how the virus replicates inside a cell. The 1918 virus was exceptionally good at replicating in the cells of the lower respiratory tract deep in the lungs, where the damage is hardest to survive. Modern seasonal flu viruses tend to replicate more in the upper respiratory tract, the nose and throat, where they are more transmissible but cause less severe disease. But knowing that the 1918 virus had these properties does not tell us exactly why it evolved them, or why that particular combination of features which has not appeared in exactly that form since was so catastrophically lethal. The virus itself, for all the genomic work, for all the high-security laboratory reconstruction, has not fully yielded its secrets. We can describe what it did. We cannot yet fully explain why it was able to do it. I want to come back for a moment to the human dimension of all this uncertainty, because I think it is easy when we talk about antigenic sin and cytokine storms and hemagglutinin in configurations to lose sight of what we are actually describing. We are describing what happened to people like Private Henry at Camp Devons, who arrived at the hospital perfectly healthy in the morning and was in respiratory distress by afternoon. We are describing what happened in the 27-year-old factories and classrooms and households across the world, in Philadelphia, in Bombay, in Brest, in the villages of Alaska. We are describing a force that reached into the most robust, most vital bodies it could find and overwhelmed them not despite their vitality, but because of it. That is not an abstraction. That is a 27-year-old father in Iowa. That is a 23-year-old nurse in Massachusetts who had been up since 3 a.m. caring for other patients when she herself fell ill. That is the Buranescu family from Part 4 and the soldiers whose letters we read in Part 3, and the little girl named Alice who stood at the top of the stairs in Kansas calling for the father who did not answer. The mystery at the center of 1918 is not just a scientific puzzle. It is a question about all of them. Why them? Why specifically the strong and the young and the just getting started? Why the ones who were supposed to carry the world forward? A century of research has given us partial answers. The science has been extraordinary, but partial is not complete. And the reason that matters, the reason it still matters today in the year we're living in, is this: the next pandemic will not announce itself. It will not come with a label identifying which population it has chosen to target. It will not wait for us to have fully understood the last one before it arrives. The history of pandemic influenza is the history of a pathogen that keeps us permanently slightly behind. We chase it across decades, across generations of scientists, across technological revolutions, from the bacteriology of Koch and Pfeiffer to the electron microscopy that first made viruses visible to the genomic sequencing tools that let us read their entire genetic code in hours. And with each generation of tools we get closer. We understand more. We are incomparably better prepared than we were in 1918. But we are not finished. The mystery is not solved. Here is what I want to leave you with, because I have been sitting with this series for a long time now, and this is where it all resolves for me into something I want you to take with you. The people of 1918 did not have the tools to understand what was happening to them. They did not have the science, the vocabulary, the laboratory equipment. They had no treatment to offer beyond rest and liquids and the inadequate comfort of human presence. They died in extraordinary numbers, in extraordinary speed, often in confusion and fear and alone. And yet they left things behind. They left the pathology reports and the autopsy specimens and the letters, including Roy Grist's letter, which described in clinical detail what a cytokine storm looks like before anyone had that name for it. They left the frozen lung tissue in Alaskan permafrost that Taubenberger's team would recover 80 years later and use to sequence the genome of the virus. They left in the blood of survivors still living decades later the immunological evidence that Schopp used to trace the lineage of the swine flu back to the original pandemic. The dead of 1918 were, without knowing it, witnesses. Their bodies were the evidence. Their tissue and their blood and their documented suffering were the raw material that the next generation of scientists picked up and carried forward. And that chain has not broken. Every flu vaccine formulated this year is built on the work of Francis and Salk. which was built on Shop's pig experiments, which were built on Olitsky, and Gates's filtered secretions, which were built on the disaster of 1918 that made the question unavoidable. Every genomic surveillance system tracking the emergence of novel influenza strains, every time a laboratory flags an unusual cluster of flu cases in a market or a farm or a ship, and starts the investigation that might catch a new pandemic, before it becomes unstoppable, that system exists because 50 million people died, and a civilization slowly and imperfectly but genuinely decided to learn. That is not a comfortable lesson. It is not the kind of lesson that offers easy reassurance. It says sometimes the price of knowledge is catastrophe, and the only thing we can do with that is make sure the catastrophe was not paid for nothing. The 1918 pandemic was not paid for nothing. Over the course of this series, we have walked through 12 parts of a story that most history books compress into a paragraph or leave out entirely. We have spent time in the mud of Camp Funston with Albert Gitchell in the crowded parade streets of Philadelphia in the wards of Camp Devons, where Roy Grist wrote his letter in the laboratory, where Richard Shope filtered pig lung samples and found the answer that Olitsky and Gates had been refused 20 years earlier. We have walked through the personal lives, the Philadelphia mother wiping down her steps with vinegar, the soldier writing a letter that would arrive after him, the nurse on her third consecutive shift, the little girl at the top of the stairs. We have walked through the political silences and the journalistic censorship, and the way an entire pandemic faded from collective memory almost as soon as it ended. We have followed the science from complete ignorance to extraordinary knowledge across a century of work, done by people who mostly did not live to see how their contributions connected to everything that came after. And we've arrived finally at the honest place, a place where the science is remarkable, and the gaps are real, where the question why the strongest bodies lost the hardest remains only partially answered, where the next pandemic waits somewhere in the world's animal reservoirs for conditions that will give it the chance to do what the 1918 virus did. I do not tell you this to frighten you. Fear is not useful, and this is not a horror story. It is a true story which is something different. I tell you this because the people who lived through 1918 deserve to be remembered. They deserved witnesses of their own. Tonight we were those witnesses. Sleep well. And if you get your flu shot this year, when the nurse calls your name and you roll up your sleeve and the whole thing takes 30 seconds and you go back to your day, I want you to think for just a moment about a 29-year-old virologist named Richard Shope, who grew up on a farm in Iowa and remembered how the pigs got sick in the autumn his neighbors were dying, and know that the chain goes that far back. Thank you for spending 12 nights with me in 1918. If this series moved you, if it changed the way you think about history or science, or the ordinary people who carry both forward without knowing it, I would love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me what stayed with you. Tell me which part of the story found you in the way that stories sometimes do. And if there is another chapter of history you want to walk through together, another story that got swallowed and deserves to be remembered, leave it below. I will be here. Good night.